Contradiction. Okay, 1 second. Okay, it appears we are going live now. So welcome to everybody who is here today on Zoom, and also welcome to anyone who's watching online. So to get started, I just want to say a few brief remarks about the conference, the format, my own motivation for organizing the conference, and then we'll get started with Dermot Moran's talk. First thing. Okay, so this conference is on truth and contradiction in Christian Neoplatonism. My name is Gregory Moss. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the main organizer of the conference. This conference is funded by the Research Grants Council of the University Grants Committee, to get these names right, in Hong Kong. So I'm very thankful for that. The grant is exploring the possibility of true contradiction in Christian Neoplatonic thought. So that's the kind of main systematic and conceptual idea that I'm exploring in the grant. I want to thank a few people briefly who just helped make this conference possible. One is the Department of Philosophy here for their support, as ever. And also a thank you to Jasmine Chan, who we'll see is with us in the Zoom call. She's been very helpful with organization. As you know, philosophers are not always the best with this kind of thing. So thank you very much. And also to the graduate students. We'll have a different graduate assistant every day helping us with the conference, and you may interact with them a bit as well as we go. Okay, and of course, last but not least, I want to thank all the invited speakers. Thank you all for accepting my invitation. All the invited speakers and the keynotes as well. I know some of you, but not everyone, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you a little bit virtually and learning from you as well, at least virtually. So I'm sorry that we had to do this online. The Chinese University usually has funding, very generous funding, to bring people here, to put them in hotels and to have a nice time together. But unfortunately, until very recently, we had rather strict quarantine measures still in place, where I know mostly in the rest of the world that had been abolished. But now travel has been opened up more or less, but it was too late to do it in person. So thank you for coming online, even though it's not the most desirable way of doing it. Okay, just some formalities about the event. So the keynote speakers have about 1 hour to speak, and then we want to try to reserve about 30 minutes for discussion. But of course, keynotes, you're invited to talk longer or shorter, just depending on how long it takes for you to finish the talk. And for the others, about 45 minutes, so it's still a good amount of time. And the ideal is to have about 15 minutes for discussion. But again, the time is yours, so you can speak for longer if you'd like and have a shorter discussion time. So if you want to raise questions after the talk, I mean, I would ask, unless the speaker says otherwise, to hold your questions until the end, unless the speaker, is inviting you to ask questions as they go. Sometimes people prefer this method. You can ask questions in the chat. Just put your name in the chat, or say you have a question in the chat box, or you can raise your virtual hand. There's that button, reactions, on the bottom, and you can raise your hand that way. You could also just, do this and try to get my attention that way, if you'd like. And if you're on YouTube and you're watching and you want to ask a question, there is a feature that allows you to do that. You can put your question in the chat box there, and we'll have one of our assistants keep track of that, and then we can pose the question to the speaker. Okay, so that's just some formalities. Just a brief note about the kind of motivation for the conference and what led me to organize it, and then we'll get started with Dermot's talk. So for my own thinking, what's been very important in my own philosophical life is thinking this Aufgabe or task of thinking the absolute or thinking the unconditioned condition. And this has really driven all of my thinking. And I've never been able to really refuse this impulse. No matter how much I've read Kant, I haven't been able to do this. Nor have I really ever been successfully able to think it without encountering contradictions over and over again. And so this experience in thinking really undergirds my motivation for the conference today. I'm interested in questions concerning the truth of the unconditioned condition or the absolute, as well as whether contradictions or the contradiction is necessary for articulating some truth about the source of all things. So this is just my general interest and background. And this systematic interest of mine also directs my historical, or gives a focus for my own historical interests, not only in German philosophy. Hegel famously says that in his dissertation that the contradiction is the form of the true. Even Hegel scholars don't like that because you don't want Hegel to think this kind of thing. But also in my reading of more recently of Pseudo-Dionysius and Meister Eckhart, there may or may not be true contradictions in their thinking. There may not be, but we do find over and over again the presence of contradiction, that their reflections on God and Gottheit regularly lead to what appear to be contradictory formulations. So I'm very interested in the metaphysical and epistemic status of these, at least apparent contradictions, what they're doing, what their function is, how to understand them in the text, and the like. So that's just a little bit of background. Some of the talks today are historical. We're exploring the thought of various thinkers, and I am interested in these thinkers for their own sake, their own ideas. I'm also interested in, you'll see some of the talks are looking at historical legacies of particular thinkers in the 19th, 20th century, not only in Western philosophy, such as the legacy of Heidegger and, the legacy of Eckhart and Heidegger's thought, but also in Japanese philosophy, 20th century Japanese philosophy. So there's also some comparative philosophy that we're going to be doing. You'll also see that we have a talk by J.C. Beale, who's an analytic philosopher. So you'll see that the conference is methodologically diverse. And recently, again, due to my interest in truth and contradiction, I've had a growing interest in dialethism, the idea of dialethism in analytic philosophy, which is this view that there are true contradictions. It's a term invented by Graham Priest and one of his colleagues. Not being trained in analytic philosophy, I'm still nonetheless interested in a variety of ideas there. So one of the big questions that comes up for me in thinking about the absolute is, if we inevitably encounter contradiction, and that's already a question that's up for debate, does this require us to rethink the structure and form of our logic, as some people have advocated in the history, or does it indicate something like that the absolute transcends what can be known via discursive reason? And does that lead us more in the direction of mysticism and these directions in thinking? So that's my general kind of systematic background and interest for doing the conference. And I'm sure some way, directly or indirectly, a lot of these talks will certainly be fruitful for me in my thinking. So you'll see in the conference, there's a variety of methods. We have historical approaches, we have historical continental approaches, so-called continental approaches, analytic approaches. And for me, this is important to have this methodological diversity. I'm really committed to it in principle. And it's something also that I think gained from my graduate studies at the University of Georgia also, where I got my PhD. Elizabeth Bryan, very happy to have her here. She was one of my teachers. And you'll see at that school, it's actually methodologically quite diverse. And so I've tried to carry this with me over time. The idea here is, if there are tools that help us in thinking, whatever they are, I want to use them and grab hold of them, wherever they may come from. So I hope you enjoy the methodological diversity. I hope it doesn't make everything inaccessible, but rather actually enriches the conversation rather than detracts from the quality of things. Anything else? I don't have anything else to add. Does anyone have any words they'd like to say before I introduce our first speaker? All right, well, let's get started. Thank you for listening to me for 10 minutes. Okay, so our first speaker today is Professor Dermot Moran. I'm very excited that he accepted the invitation to be our first keynote speaker. The talk today is the dialectic of divine being and nothingness in Johannes Scotus Erigena. He's the Joseph Chair in Catholic Philosophy at Boston College, founder of the International Journal of Philosophical Studies. There's a lot that I could say about Dermot. He's been a visiting professor at a lot of different places, Yale, Northwestern, Rice. He has interest in medieval Christian philosophy, contemporary European philosophy, especially phenomenology, and very well known for his work, I believe, in phenomenology. And I've certainly benefited from reading his own work on Eckhart and on phenomenology, and Husserl and others. He has many accolades, many books, many articles. I won't list them all. He's been awarded the Royal Irish Academy Gold Medal in the Humanities. We could all hope one day to have gold medals for our work in the humanities, but only a few received them. So without further ado, Dermot, please take it away. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thanks to all the organizers, and especially Jasmine and Wu Wei. I would also just ask Greg, because it's midnight here, I won't be able to attend most of the night's talks because I have to sleep. Are you recording them?
Yes, so these are recorded, and unless speakers request otherwise, which you're free to do, and
no, I'm happy to record, but I might ask to see some of the other ones that are going on.
So they'll remain online
through your day and through my night.
Yeah, of course, and it's totally understandable. It's actually most of the talks are a bad time for somebody.
No, I understand that.
Yeah. So they will be available online indefinitely. So you should have access to them later.
Very good. Okay, well, look, thank you so much. And I'll begin straight away so as not to waste any time. And as Gregory just said, my topic is the dialectic of divine being and nothingness in John Scotus Erigena, who is represented here on the right-hand side in this stained glass window from Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and he's holding, clutching the Perifusion. Most people know that the Perifusion, or the De Divisione Naturae, 9th century dialogue, it opens with this very strong claim about nature, that nature is the general name, Erigena says, for all things, for those that are and those that are not. Omnia quae sunt et quae non sunt. And this is the opening gesture which continued through the entire 5-book dialogue, emphasizing that, as he says, the highest and principal division of all things is into those things that are and those things that are not. And I would like to reference here Gustavo Piemonte, who is an expert on Erigena from Buenos Aires, who wrote in his very accomplished article on l'expression quae sunt et quae non sunt, Jean Scott et Marius Victorinus, in Jean Scott Écrivain. He writes that the double expression, the twin expression quae sunt et quae non sunt, of which the two antithetical members will seek to embrace the totality of the real, occurs oftenly in the writings of John Scott, as we know. So there, Piemonte points out that this opposition or antithetical pair being and non-being, appears so frequently in Eryugena as to be a mark of his authenticity when we are looking at various writings. The phrase already appears in Eryugena's first work, De Divina Predestinatione, and it goes all the way through to the expositions, his commentary on Dionysius, and on his translation of Maximus's Ambigua. The phrase even occurs in his poems. There's a set of readings here where they're referenced, which I won't bother with. But let me begin with Augustine's influence on Eryugena's De Predestinatione. It's usually thought that Eryugena was schooled in the liberal arts tradition. He wrote a commentary on Martianus Capella, and at that time he was asked to refute a monk called Gottschalk, who had written on the divine predestination. Eryugena's thesis on predestination got him into trouble because it went too far in the opposite extreme. Gottschalk had argued that there's a twin predestination, that God predestines some souls to good and to paradise and others to evil and to hell. And Eryugena argued the opposite by arguing that God doesn't even know evil and cannot be the cause of anything negative and so on. So he writes in this De Predestinatione, God cannot be both the highest essence and not be the cause of those things only that derive from him. But God is the highest essence. He is therefore the cause of those things only which derive from him. Sin, death, unhappiness are not from God. Therefore, God is not the cause of them. The same syllogism can be put this way. God cannot be both the cause of those things that are and the cause of those things that are not. But God is the cause of those things that are, therefore he is not the cause of those things that are not. Sin and its effect, death, to which unhappiness is conjoined, are not, and therefore God is not the cause of death or sin or any of these negative things. That's an extremely optimistic view, but you can see already here, Eryugena is arguing in a dialectical manner, setting out his argument in terms of syllogisms and in terms of argument from the contrary, and so on, and is involved in the exercise of dialectic. And indeed, that's what marks out his overall approach throughout his career, including in the Perifusion, is a strong emphasis on dialectic. And I'll show you at the very end a slide where he says that dialectic is not just the way in which our minds operate, but the way in which the universe or nature itself operates, in its exitus and reditus, in its outgoing and return. Now, after the De Predestinatione, I'll skip this one, Eryugena moved on to write the Perifusion, and what happened in between was his encounter with Pseudo-Dionysius, or Dionysius the Areopagite, whose works he received and was asked to translate by the Carolingian king. Now, in the Perifusion, right at the beginning, immediately after this distinction between the things that are and the things that are not, the teacher, Nutritor, offers a division of nature into 4 species or 4 divisions. Those things that are created, beginning with what creates and is not created, what is created and creates, what is created and does not create, and then this 4th division of nature, que nec creat nec creator, which neither creates nor is created. And the student, alumnus, says, I am much perplexed by the 4th species, which you have introduced. For about the other 3, I think we should not presume to raise any question at all, because as I think, the first is understood to be the cause of all things that are, and that are not, who is God. The second to be the primordial causes, and the third, those things that become manifest through becoming into being in times and places. And this leads to a long discussion about the nature of this fourth division, the things that are neither created nor create. It's a double negative. And it sort of refers to nothing. And as we'll discover later, it refers to non-being or nothingness in two senses. In the one sense, it refers to materia informis, or unformed matter, or the nothing out of which God creates the world. But on the second understanding, it refers to what he calls nihil per excellentiam, or nothingness which transcends all things because of its excellence and superiority, and that nothing he will identify as God. So before we go into that, I'll be going through that discussion. Eugenia offers 5 ways, quinque modi, in which the expression being and non-being can be understood. To me, this is unique. I do not know of any other origin to this. You find a few things in Marius Victorinus, in St. Augustine, but the 5 ways of understanding being and non-being, I think, is unique to our Eugenia. And he says their first mode is, as he says, first and highest. And according to that mode, things which fall within the perception of bodily sense or intellect are said to be, but those, because of the excellence of their nature, elude all sense and reason and intellect, are said not to be, e.g. God and the primary causes. And this first mode means that everything that is intelligible to sense and intellect can be said to be, but that which transcends or escapes sense and intellect is said not to be because of the excellence of its nature. And this mode appears in our Eugenia's homily on the prologue to the Gospel of John, where he writes, speaking about the eagle, which is always an image of John, the voice that spiritual bird who, on swiftest wings of innermost theology and intuitions of most brilliant and high contemplation, transcends all vision and flies beyond all the things that are and are not. By the things that are, I mean the things that do not wholly escape perception, either angelic or human, since they come after God, and because of their numbers do not transcend what has been fashioned by the single cause of all. And by the things that truly are not, I mean those things that actually surpass the powers of understanding. Now, what you see here is 2 things. One, the phrase, all the things that are and are not, being used in the homily. So it's one of these characteristic markers of our Eugenia's writing. But secondly, he's interpreting it as that the things that are those things that are graspable by sense and intellect, whereas those things that are not are those that transcend the powers of all understanding, as he says. Now, the second mode is one that our Eugenia talks about, whereby things can be said to be or not to be, depending on their rank in the hierarchy of nature. So he says, if we say that human beings are, then angels are not. If we say angels are, then human beings are not. It's a sort of ranking system. But this third mode, which is also very common in our Eugenia, contrasts between those things which have manifest themselves in their effects and those things which are still, as he says, wrapped up in the secret folds of nature. He writes in Parafusion, things that are in the secret folds of nature are said not to be, while those things which exist are said to be. Thus, since God, in that first and one man whom he made in his image, established all men at the same time, yet did not bring them all together at the same time into this visible world, those who already are becoming or have become visibly manifest in the world are said to be, while those who are as yet still hidden, though destined to be, are said not to be. This, if you like, is his version of Augustinian seminal reasons that if you like, those that are manifest are said to be, and those things that are still hidden in the causes are said not to be. And our Eugenia goes on to comment that there's a difference between the first mode and the third mode. And he says this: the first is found generally in all things which at the same time and once and for all have been made in their causes and effects. The third specifically in those things which are partly still hidden in their causes, partly manifest in their effects, of which in particular the fabric of this world is woven. Now, I won't go on to talk about the fourth and fifth books, but I want to shift to talking about not so much being as the nature of non-being. And Eriugena is quite famous for claiming to be inspired by Dionysius and Maximus and others, that God cannot be said to be, or is not properly said, proprie said to be. So he writes in Paraphusion, for the divine is incomprehensible to all reason and all intellect. And this would be the first mode. And therefore, when we predicate being of him, we do not say that he is, for being is from him, but he is not himself being. For above this being, after some matter, there is more than being, super esse, an absolute being beyond language and understanding. And there he's applying the first mode of being and non-being. Since God is incomprehensible and surpasses all understanding, God is more properly said not to be. And here he quotes Maximus of Comphaser. So he says, that est enim super ipsum esse, aliquo modo esse, et universaliter super quod dicitur et intelligitur. So Edouard Jonot, who's the main editor of Eriugena's Paraphusion in the Corpus Christianorum Continuatio Medievalis series, writes that Eriugena shows himself to be a loyal disciple of the Areopagite. God, being the cause of being, is above being. If he is above being, he is not being, properly speaking. But Eriugena innovates. When he applies this notion of the nothingness, the divine nothingness, to the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. When he speaks of the divine nothingness and of its theophanies, Eriugena is invoking the authority of the Areopagite, but he does so with an extreme liberty. For Jonot, Eriugena interprets being as manifesting or appearing or as theophany. And so he's commenting on Dionysius and the appropriateness of this notion of fire metaphors for God. Now, let me go a little bit further into this. This is clearly a move forward from the Paraphusion, from the earlier Augustinian approach of the De Predestinatione. Eriugena now is willing not just to say God is super esse, or beyond being, but that God is actually nihilum, or nothingness, that God belongs in the brackets of ea que non sunt, the things which are not. God is said not to be any of the things that are, he says. God is nothing of those things which are and are not. So God is even now placed in this second quotation in book 3, beyond ea que sunt et que non sunt. I'll skip this over. This is talking about confirming what Jonot says, that Eriugena thinks of God as manifesting himself in his theophanies and thus making himself be, as it were, emerging from non-being into being. So there is, if you like, two acts of creation. There's the self-creation of the divine, moving from nothingness to being, and then there's the divine speaking of the word, which manifests the second person of the Trinity, but at the same time is also responsible for the bringing about of the primary causes and the ideas, which then flow forward into the effects, and we have the whole order of the universe being created. But I want to focus, because our topic today is dialectic, on the way in which Eriugena understands this dialectical negation and affirmation as belonging to the very nature of both being and non-being, and indeed of the nature of the divinity. So Eriugena writes in book 3, that is, God produces from his super-essentiality essences, from his super-vitality lives, from his super-intellectuality intellects, from the negation of all things that are and are not, the affirmations of all things that are and are not. So the phrase now, que sunt et que non sunt, God produces from the absence of these, que sunt et que non sunt, to the affirmation of que sunt et que non sunt. It's a very strange idea. This, of course, will go forward, as we'll see later, perhaps into the writings of Nicholas of Cusa. But Eriugena is locating this dialectical motion or self-creation, if you like, or self-expression already within the nature of the divine. And as we'll see shortly, he'll also speak of the negation of the negation. Now, in general, and this will point us forward towards Meister Eckhart, Eriugena says that God is not to be understood as a being, and most definitely not as an individual being, a this or a that. God is not this, nor that, nor anything. Nec hoc, nec illud, nec ullum ille est, he says. And then he makes this extraordinary and very bold claim in a section of the Perifusion that Gustav Pimonto named the Tractatus de Nihilo, the Tractatus on Nothingness. Eriugena says, anyone who looks into it closely will not be surprised that often, sepe, in the scriptures, God himself is called by the name nihilum, or nothing. This is an extraordinary claim. Of course, it's not exactly true, but by scriptures, Eriugena is primarily referring to Dionysius. And he says this here when he's speaking further, elucidating what he means. And he refers to Dionysius. He says, now the divine wisdom is rightly called formless because it does not turn to any form above itself for its formation. For it is of all forms the undefined exemplar. And when it descends into the various forms of things visible and invisible, it looks back to itself as to its formation, and is said not to be, and to be absolutely nothing. Omnino nihil. This is the divine wisdom. But in all things it both is and is said to be, because it is the essence of the whole universe, and its substance and its genus and its species and its quantity and its quality, and the bond between all things and its position and habit and place and time and so on. And whoever shall look carefully into the words of Saint Dionysius will find that this is their meaning. So if you like, the scripture that Eriugena is referencing when he says that God is all from called nothing is, of course, Dionysius's divine names and mystical theology, which, of course, he took to be equitemporal with the writings of St. Paul, and so to have that status as being scripture. Now, he makes clear in Book 5, in several places, I've listed 2 of them here, that God is called nothing, nihil, or nihilum, he uses both phrases, due to its super-essentiality of its nature. That God transcends both being and non-being, but it's better or more proper to appropriate the word non-being for him than being. So this continues all through Ereugena's writing. So here we have a phrase or a little comment from the Expositiones in Hierarchiam Celestem, Eriugena's commentary on Dionysius's celestial hierarchy. We believe that God made all from nothing. What must be understood by this, if not perhaps that this nothing is he who, being exalted as superessential above all things and glorified beyond every word and every thought, is called not without reason nothing through excellence, nihil per excellentiam, since he cannot be in any way any one of the things in the category of the things that are. Now we'll see here, and I've written on it elsewhere, that Eriugena embraces a view that he finds in Augustine and Boethius and others, that the Aristotelian categories, which are fine for describing the created universe, do not apply to God. So God is beyond the categories, including ousia, the category of substance or essence, essentia. And God is beyond these things, or cannot be circumscribed by these categories, and therefore is in a sort of formless, pure formless state, which is also, as you'll see, infinite. And here he says, and this is one of these dialectical moves that Eugenio makes, and which are unique to him and which will have a huge influence. This exact phrase is followed by Eckhart. For when it is said, it is superessential, when one makes the statement about God, it is superessential, this can be understood by me as nothing else but a negation of essence, negatio essentiae. For he who says it is superessentially openly denies that it is essential, and therefore, although the negative is not expressed in the words pronounced, yet the hidden meaning of it is not hidden from those who consider them well. I will put a footnote in here that this is something misunderstood by Jacques Derrida when he writes his famous lecture on how not to speak about God. This lecture he gave in Jerusalem, where he's talking largely about Dionysius and the superlative way, if you like, the affirmative, the negative, and then the superlative way. Derrida claims it's a reintroduction of ontology or of positivity, whereas Eriugena is clearly here interpreting the negation of the negation as it's, or the super essentiality as being a negation, although the word is not clearly negative. To say something is super essential or supernatural is actually to make a negative statement for Eriugena. Now, as I mentioned, Eriugena thinks that his sources are in Dionysius and Maximus, and and that's what he says in the homily. He says he found the phrase nihil in Dionysius and Maximus. But others, especially Gustavo Piemonte, have also suggested Marius Victorinus, and Piemonte in particular has done a careful word analysis showing the relationship between Marius and Eriugena. I'll skip on here. In the preface to the Versio Dionysii, the translation of Dionysius, Eriugena says, more similar and closer to God are the things that are not, as opposed to the things that are. And there's more we can say about that. Some of my footnotes there elaborate on this a little bit. But Eriugena is referencing a number of statements by Dionysius. Dionysius never exactly says that God is nothing, but I will defer to Eric Pearl on this. But he does say that God is not of the non-beings nor of the being. Ude titon, uk onton, udi titon, onton est. Which Eriugena Latin renders as et omne non-ens et ens. He is both part of the non-being and the non-being. God is both every non-being and every being. Panta to onta kai udon ton onton. And Eriugena regularly quotes Dionysius' celestial hierarchy for the statement, the being of all things is the divinity who's above being. Est enim omnium est super esse divinitas, or super esse divinitatis. He will repeat this phrase many times. I won't give you all the references, but they're available here. And indeed, in a phrase that, in a passage that Eriugena quotes, using his own translation of Dionysius, he refers to the place where God is said to be pre-on, ante-on, if you like, in Eriugena's phrase. But being itself is never bereft of all things that exist. Being itself, this is Eriugena's translation of Dionysius, divine names. Being itself, indeed, is from the pre-existent, and from it is being, and being is the beginning and measure before essence, and is not itself being, and being possesses it, and owned is the substantiating beginning and middle and end, both of that which exists and of age and of all things. And therefore, by the oracles, he who is in truth pre-owned is multiplied in every notion of the things that exist, and in him is improperly celebrated what was and what is and what shall be and what has become and what becomes and what shall become. And Eugenia translates Dionysius quite interestingly in this way. Similarly, he goes on, for God is not yet owned, but he who simply and himself uncircumscribed embraces the whole himself. Therefore, he is called the King of Ages, as substitutor of the whole of being and of what exists in himself and about him. And he neither was, nor shall be, nor has become, nor becomes, nor shall become, nor indeed is. And I suppose that's the closest God is not said to be. But he himself is the being of all things that exist. And he is not only the things that exist, but the very being of the things that exist from him who exists before all ages. This is our Eugenia struggling to translate complex paragraph in Dionysius's Divine Names 5.8. Now, I mentioned the Dionysian sources here that have inspired our Eugenia, but our Eugenia is possibly also influenced by Marius Victorinus, whose works were known in the 9th century. But our Eugenia never refers to Marius. But there are similar phrases there in Marius's Ad Candidum, this letter to the fictional friend Candidus, written around the time of the Arian heresies, saying that God is above all things, all existence, and all non-existence. I won't read this, but what's interesting is just the middle bit there. Necessarily, we say that through superiority and preeminence, per prelationem et per eminentiam, God has, eminentiam and prelationem above all existence, above all life knowledge. And because transcendent, he is nothing of existence, and because he is above existence, he is nothing from existence. God is therefore Meon. Now that's clear. That's much clearer in Marius Victorinus. There's an immediate assertion that God is therefore Meon. And it's possible that our Eugenia's nihilum also refers to this idea that God can be said not to be. Marius Victorinus says, what, however, is this ta meon above ta on? He is that which is known neither as on nor as meon, but as knowable in ignorance, since he is simultaneously on and not on, who by his own power has produced and led ta on into manifestation. And I think this, that's the translation from Mary Clark. Existentia is a phrase that Marius Victorinus uses quite a bit, and it does appear in our Eugenia, so there's a possible influence there. But it's the same idea that God can be said really not to be because he's above being, but he is the cause of being in all things that exist. And therefore, in one sense, he is manifest in the things that exist. But notice that Marius Victorinus does not use the Eugenian formulation nihil per excellentiam. He rather uses per prelationem et per eminentiam. So this is not commented on by Gustavo Piemonte in his wonderful article, but I think it's significant. Makes me think that perhaps there is not a direct relationship between Marius and our Eugenia, because our Eugenia's nihil per excellentiam seems to me also to be a unique phrase that we find only in our Eugenia, but I could be wrong. Let me skip on to our Eugenia's second large influence on this notion of thinking of non-being. And again, I'm relating to the to the texts of Maximus and Pseudo-Dionysius that are referenced by Eugen and indeed translated by him in the Periphusion. And in Periphusion Book 1, he cites Maximus Confessor's Ambigua to say God alone properly subsists above being itself. Now, let me go further into this whole discussion of nihil or nothingness in Eugenes' Tractatus de Nihilo, which is in Periphusion Book 3. It's Gustavo Piemonte that gives this title Tractatus de Nihilo, but there's some justification because there are chapter titles added in the 9th century manuscript, and one of them is De Quali Nihilio Fecit Deus Omnia, of what kind of nothingness did God make all things? And the student introduces this question with, but when I hear or say that the divine goodness created all things out of nothing, I do not understand what is signified by that name nothing, whether the privation of all essence, or substance or accident, or the excellence of the divine superessentiality. So there is very clearly given that nihil can have two designations. It can either mean nihil per privationem, or it can mean nihil per excellentiam. As often is the case, when the teacher and the student are discussing things in Eugenes' Periphusion, alumnus is more Augustinian and tends to follow the view that God's essence and being are identical and that nothingness means privation. So the alumnus writes, by the name nothing then is meant the negation and absence of all essence or substance, indeed of all things that are created in nature. And the new treater rejects this view that nothingness from which God makes all things is a privation. But consider those who think that the world was made from that nothing, which means the privation or absence of the whole of essence. I don't know what to say, for I do not think why they do not bethink them of the nature of opposites. This is our dialectical thing. Why, the people who assert that everything is made from nothing understood as non-being don't know the nature of opposites. For it is impossible that there should be privation where there is not possession of essence. For privation is the privation of possession. And therefore, what possession does not precede privation does not follow. Or therefore, where possession does not precede privation does not follow. How then do they say that the word was made from privation? Again, we have Eugen showing off his dialectical skills, doing a kind of dialectical argument, saying that nothingness from which God creates all things cannot be privation, but rather is nothing per excellencia. I should believe that by the name nothing is signified the ineffable and incomprehensible and inaccessible brilliance of the divine goodness, which is unknown to all intellects, whether human or angelic, for it is essential and supernatural, which, while it is contemplated in itself, neither is, nor was, nor shall be, for it is understood to be in none of the things that exist, because it surpasses all things. But when by a certain ineffable descent, condescensio, it emerges into the things that are, and it is beheld by the mind's eye, it alone is found to be in all things, and it is and was and shall be. Now, this is a very important passage, because the notion is here that the nothing from which God creates, the ex nihilo, creation, is actually ex deo, out of God, understood as not being. Therefore, so long as it is understood to be incomprehensible by reason of its own transcendence, it's God, is not unreasonably called nothing. But when it begins to appear in its theophanies, it is said to proceed, as it were, out of nothing into something. So this is this notion. And so we have a very Hegelian dialectical notion of the divine nothingness expressing itself in being and preceding from itself into itself. A se ipsa, in se ipsam. And this is very well expressed by Parafusion, Book 3. Therefore, the divine goodness, and often goodness following Dionysius is the phrase that Ariugena uses for the divine, is called nothing, for the reason that beyond all things that are and are not, there's the key phrase again, it is found in no essence, and it descends from the negation of all essence into the affirmation of the essence of the whole universe, from itself into itself, as though from nothing into something, from non-essentiality into essentiality, from formlessness into innumerable forms and species. So this is Ariugena offering you this conception of, if you like, the divine self-creation as proceeding out of itself, through itself, in itself. And of course, he'd use these phrases also for referring to the procession of the Trinity. And here we are almost the source, possibly the direct source for Nicholas of Cusa. God is said to be formless and to be beyond all form things. For every form thing seeks him, while in himself he is infinite and more than infinite, for he is the infinity of all infinities. Infinitas omnium infinitatum. Therefore, not being defined or constricted by any form, since he is unknowable to every intellect, he is more reasonably called formless than form. For, as has been said, we can speak more truly about God by negation than by affirmation. And this theme that God's essence is not really essence, but transcends essence, because God cannot be circumscribed as infinite or cannot be defined, this is all through the Parafusion. For how can the infinite be defined by itself in anything, or be understood in anything, when it knows itself to be above every finite thing and every infinite thing, and beyond finitude and infinitude? This again shows that Ariugena goes very extreme, not just to assert the infinity of the divine, but God transcends the dialectical relation between finite and infinite. He is more than both finite and infinite. He is more than those things that are and those things that are not. Let me, I'm coming close to the end now, show you that Ariugena, I'm teaching a class at the moment on medieval mysticism, and I maintain that there is in the West a sui generis tradition of thinking about God as transcendent nothingness, that does not owe anything to Buddhism or Hinduism or any of the other forms of thinking about the negation of all things, but which is found in Dionysius and in Maximus and in Marius Victorinus, as we've seen, but which is really articulated and brought together for the first time in Ariugena, who then passes it on through a number of 12th century authors into Meister Eckhart, possibly into Margaret of Porret, and certainly into Nicholas of Cusa. Indeed, it would be another paper for me, but I will say, since there are experts on Nicholas of Cusa here, that Nicholas of Cusa is the first person to use this notion that there is a negative theology as a tradition. And he also, in the several works, but especially in De Non Aliud, but also in the Apologia Docte Ignorantiae, defends the notion that that he's not saying anything new, but he's saying what was said by Socrates and others, including, he mentions John Scotus Ariugena and Eckhart and others. So here is a statement from the sermon Renovamini Spiritu by Meister Eckhart. You should love God as he is, a non-God, a non-spirit, a non-person, a non-image. Ein Nicht-Gott, ein Nicht-Geist, ein Nicht-Persona, ein Nicht-Bilder. Rather, as he is pure, sheer, limpid one, detached from all duality. This is an extraordinary remark by Eckhart. And indeed, there are many places in Eckhart, I've written a separate paper on this, where he refers to God in various ways as ein nicht in German, or as nihil, nichts, Nichtheit, nihil and nullitas in Latin. He writes in Sermon 71, quoting St. Paul, can Paul seemingly said, God is nothing. He says, I cannot see what is one. He saw nothing. This is God. Paul, when he was struck blind, he saw nothing, which was God. God is nothing, and he is a something. Whatever is something is also nothing. This is an assertion, again, this dialectical assertion. He saw something, he saw nothing, and then identification of the two. And God is, for Eckhart, quoting Eugenea, possibly not directly, but certainly echoing Eugenea, the negatio negationis, a phrase he uses in the Latin works, but also in the German works. He says, the divine one is the negation of the negation and a denial of the denial. Ein ist ein Versagen des Versagenes and ein Verlugen des Verlugenes. And then there are a number of other phrases like that. And indeed, one finds in Eckhart a version of the second mode of being that you find in Eugenea. This, if you remember, was the hierarchical one. So where if we're on one level of the hierarchy, what is said to be above or below is said not to be. And Eckhart follows this in his Deutsche Werke. All creatures have a negation in themselves. One negates by not being the other. Things that are different from one another are negations of another. An angel negates by not being another, but God negates the negation. He is one and negates all else. For outside of God, nothing else. So here we have this exact notion that we found in our Eugenea in Eckhart. I could show it also in Cusanus, of God as being the negation of negation. I'll skip this and go to my last slide, which perhaps is a bit too small for you to see. I should have made it larger, but this is the quotation that I said I would at the beginning, or mention at the beginning, that Eugenea thinks of dialectic and indeed of affirmative and negative theology and the relation between them, not as just a practice for the human intellect, a logical or dialectical exercise that refers to minds, but as being implanted in nature itself. From this, we may see that art, this is dialectic, which concerns itself with the divisions of genera into species and the resolution of species into genera, which is called dialecticae, does not arrive from human contrivances, ab humanis machinationibus, but was first implanted in nature by the originator of all the arts that are properly so called, and was later discovered there by the sages who make use of it in their subtle investigation of reality. Surely there can't be a stronger assertion than you find here, that this dialectic of being and nothingness is not just a play of assertion and denial in the linguistic or cognitive sense, but actually is a reflection of the dynamic of nature itself. And that's, as we saw, was the beginning. Nature is the sum of all things that are and are not. And that double antithesis, as Gustavo Pimento calls it, mirrors the whole of Eugenea's work. So this is a picture to end with from the Honorius Augusto Donensis in the 12th century, wrote a summary of Eugenea's Perifusion, the Clavis Fusicae, and it's illustrated here by kind of 4 levels of reality, with God at the bottom, closing all together, pulling the curtains closed, and I will do the same. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dermot, for the really fascinating talk. So So we have a lot of time for questions and discussion. So we have 45 minutes if we'd like to use it. So the floor is open. Perhaps I will begin with a question from YouTube, since it was already posted in the chat. And Eric Pearl also responded to the question, but we'll also put it to you, Dermot, as well. So is there any relation? So here's the first question from YouTube. Is there any relation, direct or indirect, influence from Parmenides of Leah in the work and ideas of Origena, especially in the being and not being dichotomy? And,
right. By the way, I'm just seeing the chat now, so apologies, I couldn't see it when I was presenting, but I see what Eric says, and I agree with that. Dionysius more than once says that God is udein ton onton, and none of the things that are, as Eriugena says. But you're right, to my knowledge, he never uses the word udein or nihil or nothing directly for the divine. So he's more roundabout than that, and that is what the commentators, Jonot and others, say also. I just read a very nice article on Meister Eckhart by Alois Haas in the Meister Eckhart, I don't know if you can see that, yearbook, the Eckhart Review, called The Nothing of God and Its Explosive Images. And he says, it is in fact Dionysius who's the originator of all later statements referring to God as nothing. But then he goes on, when he quotes him, it's not exactly nothing. God is nothing in all, is one phrase, or God is neither soul nor spirit, etc. And he gives on many things. He says the background of all these statements is to be found in the ideas of Proclus on the one, which according to him can be described as the nothing, all of which it causes and maintains within its own being. So we know, and Eric is the expert on this, that Dionysius probably was a student of Proclus, Christian student of Proclus. And so there is a sort of influence of Proclus into Dionysius and into Eriugena then as a result. Marius Victorinus was influenced by Porphyry, and there is also a discussion in Porphyry of, you know, the non-being beyond being, or the nothingness beyond the one. And both these traditions of post-Platinian Platonism do speak about a first principle which is so formless and empty and empty of signification that it can't be spoken about at all. And so it is this tradition of late Platonism that is probably lurking behind the writings of Marius Victorinus and Eriugena. But it's not, there is no direct influence of Parmenides. And sadly, Parmenides, the name, shows up only once in Eriugena in his commentary on Martianus Capella's De Nuptiis Philologiae et Mercuriae, this famous liberal arts handbook of Martianus Capella, where there's a long discussion of etymologies, and they take various names and suggested, and he says Parmenides, that means sitting on a rock. And so there's only that one reference. In some respects, that's not a bad etymology of Parmenides, that he's sort of immobile on a rock. But there is no reference to Parmenides in Eriugena's work. And it really is, this is the important, Parmenides gets lost. And indeed, Plato's commentary, well, both Parmenides, the dialogue, and Proclus's commentary on Plato's Parmenides are all rediscovered in around the 15th century, late 14th, 15th century. And it's Nicholas of Cusa who imports large parts of the commentary into his own text. And indeed, it's Cusanus who makes the connection with certainly Proclus and Parmenides as being the sources of this via negationis. Sorry, that's what I wanted to say. And indeed, Eric, you did say that. I only looking at your second comment now that you are saying the same as was referenced in Alois Haas's paper that Plotinus's God is not any of these things. But you'll find that also in Augustine. All things can be circumscribed by the categories, but the categories cannot circumscribe God. So there's a sense in which God is outside of ousia. And indeed, Augustine says that very clearly in the Confession and elsewhere. But when you're talking about this tradition, you really have to be careful to recognize how much is lost. We know far more about ancient Greek philosophy than, the medievals did. Indeed, we know more than the 19th century. So there's more knowledge of Greek philosophy now than there was in the medieval period. So the further we get away, it's not that we've lost more, we're recovering more. Eriugena, he had only 3 or 4 books of Augustine and the works of Dionysius and two books of Maximus to work on. And I think it's what's extraordinary in his work is how he manages to create this grand synthesis from such a little background sources. He never read Plato except a small part of the Timaeus, which he references in the translation of Chalcidius. The works, and probably all he knew of Aristotle was the categories. So there really isn't any knowledge of the Greeks.
Thanks a lot, Dermot. I think Ian has a question. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for this genealogy of the application of the idea of nothingness to God. It was really helpful for me in my work on Eckhart. My question concerns categories and what you just mentioned about the inapplicability of categories to God. And maybe this is just a clarification question, but I believe on one of your slides, you said that God belongs to the things that are not. And I'm wondering about that use. Is that just a stage in this development? Because it seems like there's a tension there between saying God belongs to the things that are not, so is of the category of the things that are not, on the one hand, and then saying God is transcending all things which are and all things that are not. And so how am I to understand that relation? Because I think I would need to understand the nothingness of God differently from the way in which I'm understanding the nothingness of the things that are not. So how do I understand those two nothings?
Well, it's a good question. And I think Eriugena's way of answering this is to say there isn't just one way to understand these categories of what is and what is not. As I said, he introduces 5 ways of talking about these things. And although I only focused on really 2 of those ways, the 5 ways give you different approaches. In my own many years ago book on Eriugena, now it's 1989, so it scares me how long ago it was. I talked about a certain kind of pluralist, or what I call at that time a perspectivalist view in Eriugena, that one understands being and non-being in different ways at different stages of what we might say now is the dialectic. So that's sort of answering your question. That Eriugena does say, first of all, and Eckhart is the same. Eckhart will say, look, we can say God is being. And he said, yes, God is esse, he's the fullness of being, he's actus purus and all the rest of it. Eckhart will say that in the Parisian Questions, but then he say, but really, he's the cause of being, and whatever is the cause of being, yes, has everything that's in being, but is more than being, and then we are already on an ascent to, God is non-being. But Eriugena goes further and says God is beyond what is and is not, as you quoted. And as we saw, it says God is not just the cause of the author of finite things, but he's the author of infinite things, and he's beyond finitude and infinitude. And when you get that, your sort of mind is sort of boggling, because you're beyond all the categories, and you can't sort of sustain them. And this is the idea, and I have quotes that I skipped over, where Eckhart would say something similar, that because God is one, is indistinct, there is no distinctions, and therefore you cannot have, you cannot retain even this saying, well, God is just beyond being through excellence, and that's enough. Aristotle is constantly negating. I think the message is, for whatever assertion you make, you have to make a negation. And so there's a constant dialectic. That's how I understand that, Ian.
Good. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up about this idea, well, that Origen has, that God is the infinity of infinities, and this idea that he transcends the dialectical relationship between the finite and the infinite, or transcends all finitudes, finite things and all infinite things or infinities. When he talks about infinities in that sense, what does he have in mind? What are the infinities that God transcends?
Yeah. It's I mean, he uses the phrase all the time, infinities in the plural, infinitates, which is itself unusual. And again, I don't know if there's any source of this, but I think he's thinking of the primary causes. In his discussion, you know, Aristotle is a Platonist. He thinks that the effects, the spatio-temporal world that we live in, are the effects of these primary causes. But he says all the time that the primary causes are not like distinct forms, archetypes, you know, so that goodness and equality are different from one another. In the end, he often uses this image that they're like spokes of a wheel, or rays emanating from a single source. And they are all manifestations of the infinite nature of the divine, or the logos, or the verbum, or the second person. They are all ways of, they're all theophanies of the divine, as a matter of fact. And in that, they are infinitely rich. So Aristotle does say that, you know, there was a big debate among later Platonists in the reading of Plato as to what forms, how we should order the forms, and indeed how we should read the dialogues. You know, does justice come before beauty, or the other way around, or what's more important, being or goodness? And Aristotle goes through all of this and says we can start anywhere we like, and it's kind of like going in a circle. We can go in, we can penetrate the divine through any of these primary causes. And indeed, in similar manner, he does use the word infinite for referring not just to the nature of the forms, but the nature of Scripture. He says that that Scripture has infinite meanings, which is, you know, and that's so. Well, he says innumerable, I think, to be exact. But he says it has as many meanings as there are colors in a peacock's tail. This is this famous simile he uses. And that's the idea, I think, that ultimately we are in a sort of multi-semantic space of theophanies. And if we approach it correctly, we can, you know, ourselves participate in the divine infinity or lack of circumscription, because we too, and this I left all this out, but Aristotle thinks we as human beings are images of the divine, and in that respect, we too cannot be defined or limited. So the number of infinities includes us, and in a way, all the logoi, or the thea telemata, he uses that phrase, the divine willings. Because anything that issues from the divine is divine. I mean, it's not just divine, but it's infinite. So in a way, that's why Aristotle argues, and I'm sorry, this is entirely separate discussion, that space and time are limitations that belong to our minds, the fallen self, and that the original creation had no spatiality or temporality in it at all, that everything was created at the same level as the divine. So I think, does that answer your question, Elizabeth? It's a good point.
Yeah,
I'd like to know about Dionysius. So I could ask you one actually as to whether that phrase of more than infinity appears in Cusanus. I think it does. I think he also says something along those lines, but I'd forgotten.
I don't know. That's and it was somebody else who's working on Cusanus maybe knows what you're thinking of, but I'm not.
Because I know he says he's the coincidentia oppositorum, and he's the opposite of. Eriugena also has the phrase that God is the opposite of opposites. Oppositio oppositorum. Actually, I see Eric's hand up, so perhaps.
Eric, please.
Yeah, in connection with the same issue, I was really struck by that point, which I hadn't noticed before in Eriugena, about the God transcending both finite and infinite. And that's where it just struck me that it's just so resonant of Proclus, for whom finite and infinite, limit and unlimited are the primary, as a duality, are the primary manifestations of the first, and run through all the levels from the very, very highest, the one being, down to the very, very lowest sensible things, and that the all things are composed out of limit and unlimited, and that the first transcends that pair, right? Not just transcends finitude, but transcends infinity. And so I was wondering if, in terms of sort of tracing the lineage here, since Eriugena didn't have Proclus himself, if we should look in Dionysius and Maximus, who did. To see if
I think you're right.
That idea beyond finite and infinite. There, because it's. I mean, of course, he could have come up with this by himself. I mean, he's a great thinker in his own right. But the parallelism with Proclus was just so striking at that particular point.
I must get that. And actually afterwards, if I can ask you, Eric, to send me the reference in Proclus's work, I would love to look this in more detail. But you're absolutely right. And I suspect that it comes, Eriugena, as I said, had only a few books to hand. And one of them was his commentary, was the Versio Dionysii, his own translation of Dionysius's collected works. But he does such an amazing job of finding these oppositions and indeed highlighting them. Just exactly like we've seen, he uses the word nihilum, not exactly, perhaps more emphatically, shall we say, than Dionysius does with reference to the divine. And similarly, Eriugena likes to build this dialectic of being and non-being and put God either as the being of all beings or as the non-being beyond being. But then he wants to say, well, he's gone, both. Both and neither. And that move, and he insists that's a kind of perfectly acceptable dialectical move. That puts him in another category. I have not looked into this, but I did look into. There was a Fredegesius, there was a 9th century author who wrote De Nihilo et Tenebris, a work on the nature of nothingness from the Latin tradition, and you find a little bit in Alcuin and others talking about the nature of the nothingness from which God creates all things, and the meaning of the divine darkness. There is some elements of that, but this idea that transcendence so radically breaks with all opposition that even the first, if you like, first opposition has to be transcendent. That's wonderfully Eriugenian, I think, and something that captures. I always feel. I mean, he himself said the Greeks are more subtle than the Latins, and I too think that he recognized that probably in Maximus. I think there may be phrases like that in Maximus. I don't know Maximus well at all, and I think that answers probably Elizabeth Bryant also, that I think Maximus Confessor would have things of, sometimes there's phrases like from infinities to infinities, or through infinities, per infinitate, and so on. There's a number of these things. Okay, but thanks, Eric. I'd like to get that reference.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I have a question, but I will wait until anyone else may have a question they'd like to ask. Let me check YouTube and see. Okay, actually, there is a question from YouTube, so let me relay this first, and then I'll save my question for the end here. So the question that we're getting here from YouTube is, I'll just read it. How does Erugena understand the generative activity of God as tied to the super-essential nothing? I am reminded of Dionysus, who speaks of God's inner eros compelling an ecstatic movement. So that is
very good. Thank you. Actually, I don't know if you can paste that into the chat so I could see it, but Eriugena does not. Jean-Luc Marion is putting a lot of emphasis now on the notion of eros in Dionysius, and Eriugena is much more intellectualist. It's something I've noticed all along. I've always thought of it as a kind of intellectualist mysticism, and his primary way of thinking about the divine generativity and the divine self-creation and the creation of the universe is always the one of speaking the word, of clamor, like Augustine, the idea of the voice or the word echoing in the darkness or echoing in the cave. So Eriugena often talks about how the mind on its own is silent and doesn't exist, but it expresses itself in words, and so comes to exist in its words. So you don't know what you're thinking until you say it, and then you see what you're thinking. And Eriugena thinks of that as being a sort of dynamic that's present in the divine mind, that divine mind, the movement from the Father to the Son is the movement of the expression of the Logos. And this is very central to the homily sermon that he gives on the in the beginning was the Word. So he tends to think of it as explicatio. There was one slide where I used the word, or he uses the word condescensio. The condescension, or the expression outwards as being a sort of unfolding. He doesn't use the word, to my knowledge, explicatio, that is used by Cusanus, but he comes close to that idea. But it's for him always a kind of, well, there's two ways. One is the word, the speaking of the word, from silence to word, from thought to expression. But the second one is moving through the categories, from the one through the genera to the species to the individuals. So he tends to think of the explication, the self-generative activity, if you like, as a moving from genera to species to individuals, and then a return back up through those categories. Okay. But I can, just while I'm in the moment of silence here, point out that yes, you speak in that. Thank you. I now see, Greg, the chat version. I'm reminded of Dionysius, who speaks of God's inner eros compelling an ecstatic movement. Eriugena does have this notion of ecstasis, and he does have this notion of the human mind becoming one with the one, merging with the one, so that in the end of all things, so more at in the fifth book, when he's talking about the return of all things, there's a sort of a general return and a special return, and there's a long discussion. He talks about recapitulatio. There is a return of all things following Origen, whom he did know. I should have said that Origen is a possible source also for Eriugena. I mean, definitely he knew something of the De Principiis, probably in the translation of Rufinus, but we're not sure exactly. But he does refer to Origen's idea of the general return of all things. But he then says there's a special return, and that to very few people is it given, not just to return to the divine, but to become one with the divine. And he mentions in particular St. Paul, who was wrapped up in the third heaven, and also Moses, who got to see God in the burning bush. So the very highest sages or humans go further in the return of all things to the one and become one with the one and end up seeing as God sees. And that's very close to, or at least that's much more emphatically expressed in Meister Eckhart for the entry of the human to the divine mind. One final note, I should say, Werner Bayer-Valtes has written a lovely paper on Eriugenes' phrase, duplex theoria, the double mode of viewing. We view things, subspecie temporis, but we also view things subspecie eternitatis. And so we have this kind of dual mode, Eriugenes thinks, but so does God. That's the sort of interesting thing. And so we share in the divine mode of viewing. But that's this ecstatic, getting outside of oneself, getting outside of one's created nature. This is a central theme in Eckhart, how we have to durchbruch, we break through our own nature to become one with the one.
Thanks, Dermot. Okay, I'll take the opportunity as the moderator to also ask a question until someone else raises their hand. So my first question is more of a comment, but I'm interested to hear your view on this. I was happy to hear you say that this view of God as nothing, this concept of the transcending nothingness, is sui generis in the Western tradition. And I was thinking about there's a nice book by Ueda Shitsutero. He's a Japanese philosopher, right? And, actually recently died just a few years ago, who wrote this, what I think is a wonderful book, Gottes Gebot in der Seele, on Meister Eckhart. And he compares Zen, the Zen concept of nothingness, with Eckhart. Just to plug a translation that I recently did, I just finished the translation from the German into English on this comparison.
Of Ueda's book? Oh, yes. Very good. I know Ueda's book very well.
Yeah, good. So it's the translation is not the whole book. It's just Ueda's comparison of Zen and Eckhart.
Okay, right.
Which I found very fruitful for my thinking to help me unpack some of my confusions.
Well,
so
I'm freshly back from the Meister Eckhart Gesellschaft meeting in Vienna 2 weeks ago, where we were indeed discussing this very notion. And I told them, as I'll tell you, that when I've been offering a course on Christian mysticism, which I hadn't taught since I was teaching at Yale, because I never had enough graduate students to do a serious kind of class like that. So now that I'm back at Boston College, it does seem possible for me to do that. So, the very first thing I had to tell them is we're not reading Sufism, and we're not reading Taoism, and we're not going into Zen Buddhism, and we're not doing all these Shinto and all these other kinds of things, because we're studying the Western Christian mystical tradition. Now, when I say sui generis, clearly there are backgrounds in Judaism, which were then Hellenized. But I mean, really, the Hellenic world had its own version of these things. you could, and I know people who are trying to show the links through Persia and the Silk Roads and so on. You can show parallels, but they are at best parallels. But one of the first things I had to do with my own students, and that I think we'll have to do with Eckhart and others, is say, look, they were working out of a very distinctive Christian tradition. And although you can get lots of illumination by comparing them with other people, don't think that they're sort of, at best, just mouthing Zen enlightenment ideas. So we're going to have to take Eckhart back. Now, actually, Ueda is good because he's very careful about that, but there are others who are less careful. Yeah. Suzuki, I think, was less careful.
Yeah, and actually, this is something that I wanted to follow up on. Is that's one of the advantages of Ueda's account, is he says exactly what you're saying here, is that in Zen, he says, we say nothing. But Meister Eckhart says God is nothing. And he says there is a big difference between saying God is nothing and then simply saying nothing. And so Ueda is speaking from the Zen tradition, and he's an advocate of it and a practitioner of it. So, so it's, I think, a very illuminating.
No, I know this, and I know, Ueda was, as far as I know, a student of Nishitani.
Yes.
And you're already, if you are in Japanese studies, into modernity, because Nishitani and Nishida were part of a modernizing post-Hegelian movement within Japanese thinking. And indeed, I've been in Kyoto, and I know people who are very deep into the Kyoto school talking about this. And often they see Eckhart as a sort of representative, if you like, in the West, the mirror image, if you like, of their own thinking, and thinking, oh, so you have Eckhart, that's the closest you'll get to us, sort of thing. And we do the same, but it's a method of comparative philosophy that I'm against. So that's what I'm trying to say. I think rather more Heideggerian, that we've got to follow our own trajectory from the birth story within the Greek world. So that, just to give you one example, I was only discussing this the other day. Paradisus is a Greek word. The notion of going to paradise, which is in origin and all that, is a Hellenic idea. It's I think it's the book of Daniel. In the Old Testament, or in the Hebrew scriptures, the discussion is everlasting life. But the idea of heaven in this sense is a very complicated westernized notion. What makes another huge difference, which needs to be discussed more, and I'm working on this separately, is the emergence of the notion of personhood in Western philosophy, which is not a Greek concept, or prosopon, of course, but really it gets developed in three areas: Alexandrine grammar, first, second, third person; Roman law, person is someone who can own and dispose property and has freedom and so on, not a slave; and Christian theology. And this emergence in the 4th century of persona as a way of articulating the relations of the Trinity, that radically separates the traditions we're just talking about, the Buddhist and the Western one. But the problem is that both Eriugena and Eckhart downplay the Trinitarian distinctions. And indeed, you can suggest that this is also true in Dionysius. I'll defer again to Eric. But Eriugena dismisses the filioque question as being, look, we can start anywhere we like. It's a bit like the forms. We can go around in a circle. You can think of the Father as proceeding through the Son, but you can think the other way too. And Eriugena sort of relativizes the relations between the Trinity. And indeed, there was a slide I had where Eckhart says God is a nicht Person, a not person. And that does show you that Eckhart and Eriugena are themselves in a very uncomfortable relationship to what you might call the classic personalist approach to the divine. So the thing is very complicated. I wouldn't like to have an easy answer, but let me just say something about you, Wade. I call him Wade. You say Wada? Is it? Yeah. I have good contacts in Korea. And so I wrote to one of them who is translating Eckhart into Korean, a man called Lee, Professor Lee. And I asked him, in Korea, was the reception also via Buddhism? And he said, no, not at all. That's the Japanese. We understand it through Christianity. I found that most interesting. This is part of the sort of paradox of the so-called East meets West, that Korea is 50% Christian. And he said, no, Eckhart emerged in Protestant theology in discussions in Korea. And the whole Eckhart Rezeption, as they say in German, is quite distinct, it's distinctly different in Korea than in Japan. And I think what I would say, the Eriugena Reception is still so amorphous that it hasn't really formed itself into traditions like that. Although I did meet a Japanese professor whose name I've just forgotten, who translated Eriugena into Japanese and is part of that kind of Kyoto school. So there is a sort of recognition of the need to recover these people, but it's a bit like us baptizing, Plato and others for our own purposes in the Western tradition. You have to be a little careful of these balances.
Yeah, and it's a corrective measure. Wada's text is a corrective measure against the public appropriation of people like.
For example, I read Wada's book and some articles he wrote, and there's a guy called Christian Jung who has written also on the meaning of nothingness in Eckhart. Christian Jung was at this conference, and indeed we were talking about this point that the notion of poverty of spirit, for example, an emptying out, and Gelassenheit and Abgeschiedenheit or Abgescheidenheit, as it is in the Middle High German, is very specific to Eckhart. He has his own version of it. So Marguerite Porret's version of the annihilation of the soul is different, although related. And so I think that we have to sort of get a sort of taste for the difference, as I tried here a little bit, the difference between Dionysius and Eriugena. Because they're all trying to follow each other, but they do it in a distinctive manner. And so the infinity of infinities, I think that's Eriugena. I'm not sure it's in, Dionysius and so on. We have to look for those kinds of things. It's quite complicated, showing what is originality versus what is transmission in these classical texts.
Maybe one final comment, Ed, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this issue. Thinking forward from Eriugena to later developments in the tradition, you mentioned, and I was happy to hear, the Hegelian dimension of this kind of retroactive look back. So, for example, the discussion of the power of the negative, the negation of negation, and what you can see is something like the way in which Christian Neoplatonic thinking is really important for what comes much later in the 19th century. And Hegel's thinking of the power of the negative really arguably has its source in this in these.
Not only arguably. Not just arguably, but I mean actually, because two things. One, Hegel himself refers to Eriugena and does so as seeing him as the author of dialectical philosophy and speculative philosophy. And Hegel knew of Eriugena through a Danish scholar called Hjort, who'd written a book in the 1820s, I think. in German about Eriugena. But Hegel's students were the first to actually do work on Eriugena. Huber was one of them, and Stockelmeyer and various other German 19th century German Protestant theologians. And they were looking for a speculative theology using this dialectic. And Hegel himself refers to Eriugena for having identified vera ratio and true reason and true, oh God, what is the phrase? Authority, sorry. Authority and reason. True authority and true reason are one and the same. It's a phrase Eriugena uses, and that's the one phrase that Hegel knew of Eriugena. So he says, he's arguing that what we accept on faith can also be apprehended, an authority we apprehended through reason. So the inner essence, if you like, of Christianity is a rational dialectical structure, and that's the essence of the Neo-Platonic, the appropriation of the Neo-Platonic by the Hegelian tradition in the 19th century. And from that emerged the production of texts and other things in German, the first editions of Eriugena and others. So the speculative, and partly because the speculative idealists of the 19th century had a language for coping with the kind of dialectical tensions we've been talking about, of finite into infinite into finite and returning to infinite, and so on. Or the idea of the spirit negating itself in order to become itself more truly, and these kinds of notions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the illuminating talk and the discussion. Does anyone have any final comments? It's about 9:45, so we're right on time. Okay, well, go ahead.
I'll just comment, I'll let you just go, but I just see that I agree with Ian Moore's comment here that Eckhart would have said he would have abandoned the notion of person when he kind of goes to the own ground of the soul, because the ground of the soul is identical with the divine, and it's that's also the unchanging part. But we could have a long discussion about that, of the relation of Eriugena to Eckhart. Again, it's probably the case that Eckhart knew Ereugena's homily, but probably under the name of Origen, because that's how it circulated in the Middle Ages. So, Sorry, there's a...
Sorry, yes, only one comment. Isn't Albert the Great receptor of Eriugena? He's a close reader, I think, of Eriugena, and he might be a source for Eckhart, right?
Oh, 100%. I leave out... My only reason for leaving him out is I just don't know enough about Albertus, but you're absolutely right. Albertus was a major influence on Eckhart. And he was, if you like, another compositor of many of these concepts in Eriugena. But, I had done a little work on the reception of Eriugena in the 13th century, but it is connected to the condemnation of David of Dinant and Amory of Ben, who were two Parisian masters, Aristotelians, one of whom said God is forma omnium, and the other said God is materia omnium, and both were attacked and condemned in various by Pope Honorius II. But in 1210 and 1225, there was two encyclicals. But Thomas Aquinas refers to this in his discussions, to especially David of Dinant, whom he attacks quite strongly. And they associated Eriugena's Perifusion with those texts. They thought the book on nature was the same book, actually, as David of Dinant's book on nature. So there was a sort of confusion. So I don't know, because I don't know Albertus, how he would have stood in relation to the fact that Eriugena was now being declared a heretic.
I know that in the condemnation in 1241 against apophatism,
Yes.
And that Albert there, he resources to Eurygena, and I guess that to Dionysius also, and to many others, in order to elaborate or re-elaborate the negative tradition and save it somewhere. There's an article by Weber, I think it's the name, who's a Dominican.
I would like to get the reference, because I'd certainly like to look this up.
I'm looking for it. Wait, here it comes.
And let me just say that Cusanus mentions Albertus as being one of the sources of the Via Negativa.
Yes.
So
Yes,
Albertus,
exactly.
I mean, as I keep saying, and indeed, I have another paper on this. Cusanus is the one who first puts together all these people as belonging to a tradition. So if you want to say, where does the Via Negativa as a tradition get its name? It gets it through Cusanus, who's the first one to talk about negative theology as such in the Latin, and in the, I think it's chapter 25 of the first book of
Doctor. Yes.
yeah, the De Docta Ignorantia. Oh yes, thank you very much. I will have to look that up. Thank you so much. I'll take a note of that now. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's been a really nice discussion. I think it's best if we take a short break before we come back to hear Eric Pearl's talk. So we can take
Eric. Thank you. So listen, let me just apologize, Eric. It's 2 a.m. now. And so I don't think I can stay up to listen, but can you please send me your talk or your PowerPoint, whatever you're using?
I can send you the talk.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks,
Yeah,
Eric. And I'll see you in a few weeks.
Yes, in a few weeks. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay.
Right.
And I don't know when I'll see the rest of you, but I'll try, and you'll see me hovering in the background at various points, hopefully on day 2. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming by. Bye-bye. Okay,
Thank
so
you,
see everybody in 10 minutes. Okay, thanks. Eric, do you have a PowerPoint to share or a handout? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, I have a document to share. So, do you want me to put that up now? Or?
Maybe after I give the brief introduction, then
okay.
Wait another minute or so. Okay, I think it's 10 o'clock, so we can get started. So our next speaker is Professor Eric Pearl, who is Professor of Philosophy at Loyola Marymount University, where he was recently, I believe, the department chair. In the past, he's also worked at the Catholic University of America, and he's the author of a number of books, one on Dionysus, as a commentary as well on Plotinus's Aeneid's 5:1, and the book about metaphysical thinking in the Western tradition. The PhD is from Yale, and he has interests in Neo-Platonism, Plato, ancient philosophy. And today we're going to hear a talk on Augustine entitled Lux Mentium, Lux Mundi, Performative Contradiction and Truth in Augustine. So thank you very much. Floor is yours.
Okay, let me bring up a document to share here, which has a few of the long quotations that I'll be using on it. And now I need to bring back everybody's images. So there, okay. So I begin with this passage from Chesterton, which, as Ian knows, I have posted up on the wall right outside my office. Today, the part of a man that a man does assert is exactly the part he ought not to assert, himself. The part he doubts is exactly the part he ought not to doubt, the divine reason. At any street corner, we may meet a man who utters the frantic and blasphemous statement that he may be wrong. Every day one comes across somebody who says that, of course, his view may not be the right one. Of course, his view must be the right one, or it is not his view. We are on the road to producing a race of men too mentally modest to believe in the multiplication table. Chesterton wrote these words more than a century ago, and they're even more true today than they were then. Relativism, psychologism, and subjectivism are the order of the day. We have now produced the men who refuse to believe in the multiplication table. The bizarre notion that thinking is a subjective phenomenon poisons our entire intellectual atmosphere. Academics flaunt their scholarly subjectivity, regarding it not as an imperfection to be overcome as far as possible, but as a source of pride that their research is conditioned by their own backgrounds and perspectives. Phrases such as the social construction of knowledge are tossed off as truisms. How often have we seen, not only in our students' papers, but in reputable scholarly articles, expressions like Plato believes, as if the purpose of reading the dialogues were to find out what Plato believed, rather than whatever insight or wisdom or truth we can find in them. Or as if Plato, or anyone else worth reading, wrote to tell us what he thinks, rather than what is true. Such formulations point to an underlying presupposition that whatever anyone says can only be an expression of himself, not of the truth. All such subjectivism, represented in Plato's time by sophists like Protagoras, is what Plato most fundamentally opposed, insisting above all that truth and being is and can be known. And all Platonism consists in working out the conditions for this to be the case. Thus, Richard Rorty describes the Platonic impulse as, quote, the impossible attempt to step outside our skins, the traditions, linguistic and other, within which we do our thinking and self-criticism, and compare ourselves with something absolute, quote. And perhaps I should make clear that I'm aware that Rorty always repudiates the label relativism, but that's just a quibble about words. What I mean by relativism is the idea that's expressed in that quotation and countless others like it. So if Rorty or anyone else doesn't wish to call that relativism or subjectivism, so be it. It's that idea that I'm addressing and critiquing. The idea that we cannot step outside our skins, that all thinking is conditioned by our physical, historical, cultural, linguistic, societal, economic, etc. situation is a commonplace and might appear to be common sense. But it is manifestly self-contradictory. In asserting that it is impossible to step outside our skins, Rorty himself is tacitly claiming to step outside his skin and enunciate a universal absolute truth. Such claims are termed performative contradictions, or sometimes pragmatic or dialectical contradictions, because the contradiction lies not between two propositions or within one proposition, but between a proposition and what is necessarily implied in the act of affirming or thinking it. Any claim that all thinking, including therefore this thought, is relative or subjective immediately undermines itself. It cannot be true, because if it were true, it would invalidate its own truth. In the words of Gaston Isay, the principle of objectivity is affirmed in each and every act of knowledge. It is a first fact, a necessity of which we are prisoners, and which we cannot deny without giving up our quality of thinking beings. Even this act of negation would itself be an exercise of thought, an affirmation of the objectivity of that thought. And again, Isay says, in the words of St. Augustine and St. Thomas, if nothing is true, it is true that nothing is true. There is then something which is true. This is an old and some might say a tired argument against relativism, subjectivism, or skepticism of any kind, but it remains unanswered and unanswerable. One of its strangest features is that, in the words of David Schindler, a former student of mine, it invariably fails to convince anyone but those who don't need convincing. The usual response is not to refute the argument, but to ignore or dismiss it, to shrug it off with a so what. The relativist must respond in this way, for to reply to this or to any argument would be to take a definite position and so cease to be a relativist. Indeed, it is altogether impossible to meet the relativist intellectually, for insofar as he commits himself to any definite thought, he is not a relativist, and insofar as he is a relativist, he does not think anything. But as Aristotle observes in just this context, one does not converse or argue with a plant. Or as Thomas Aquinas puts it, the person who by his own admission thinks nothing non est audiendus is not to be listened to. As a rhetorical weapon aimed at defeating or convincing the relativist, then, the performative contradiction argument is indeed valueless. In an important sense, there is no one there to defeat. But if we seek not victory or power, but truth, we must, like Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine, recognize the argument for what it is. No mere rhetorical trick, but, to borrow a phrase from another context, the very pillar and foundation of truth. Although the argument itself is a familiar one, its far-reaching implications are seldom fully recognized. What it reveals is that in thinking at all, we are always already outside our skins and in the presence of absolute truth. To recognize that one's thought is limited by one's personal, cultural, linguistic, or any other conditions is already to have adopted a stance outside those limiting conditions. To think anything is necessarily to think that what one is thinking is true, and so lay claim to what Thomas Nagel terms the view from nowhere, or what used to be called more boldly, the God's eye view. If so many choose to ignore the performative contradiction argument, this is perhaps because it does indeed lead directly to the absolute, or God, at the very center of the self. But the alternative to making absolute truth claims is to deny that one is thinking, performative contradiction again, or, impossibly, not to think. Both Hegel and Wittgenstein are using the performative contradiction argument when they point out the incoherence of suggesting that thinking is limited, that it does not possess reality itself. As Hegel says, our knowledge of a limit can only be when the unlimited is on this side in consciousness. Or as Wittgenstein puts it, to be able to draw a limit to thought, we should have to find both sides of the limit thinkable. In making this point, they're paraphrasing Parmenides himself. The same is thinking and being. To suggest that thinking is confined to its own subjectivity, that being lies beyond the reach of thought, is already to think this supposedly inaccessible being, for it is not possible, and thus is itself a performative contradiction. Being means and can only mean intelligible, for it is not possible to mean, that is to think, anything else. The identity of being and intelligible is therefore the inescapable presupposition of all thinking. If I am thinking at all, then, I must recognize that truth is present to me, that my thinking is not merely mine or that of my cultural or linguistic community, but is illumined by or shares in absolute thinking, which possesses and is one with being itself. Thinking without truth is like breathing without air or seeing without light. And truth itself, the light of minds, absolute thinking which is identical with being, discovered within myself through a self-reflexive inward turn, whereby I attend to the ever-present condition for me to be thinking at all, is Augustine's God. The first work that Augustine undertook after his conversion, although not the first that he completed, is Against the Skeptics. If we make the effort to distill some philosophical significance from this amorphous, verbose, and highly rhetorical work, we find that he verges on the performative contradiction argument, although he does not quite articulate it expressis verbis. Instead of making the simple point that in saying that it is impossible to know anything, the skeptics are claiming to know this, he addresses their dependence on Zeno the Stoic's attempt to define an ultimate foundation for knowledge. Zeno proposes that what is seen is such that it can be known and understood, if it is such that it has no marks in common with what is false. According to Augustine, the skeptics accept this definition, but argue that no such thing can be found, and therefore deny that anything can be known. To this, Augustine replies, "Wherefore does this please you, most zealous and learned men? Zeno's definition moves us, they say. Why, I ask? For if it is true, then he who knows it knows something true. If false, it ought not to move those who are most constant. And again, if you cannot refute Zeno's definition, you have this itself which you perceive. But if you refute it, you do not have it by which you are impeded from perceiving. In short, if Zeno's definition is true, then in knowing it, we know something true. If it is not true, then it cannot serve as a premise in an argument for skepticism. Implicitly, therefore, this is a version of the performative contradiction argument, showing that the supposed demonstration of the impossibility of knowledge depends on knowing something. Thus, in response to the more limited skepticism, which says that the things we do not know are those which are inquired into among philosophers, Augustine replies flamboyantly, "O Grecian diligence, you go forth girded and equipped, but you do not notice that this definition itself is discovered by philosophy, and is fixed and established in the vestibule of philosophy. If you attempt to cut it down, the two-edged axe will rebound against your own legs." Having shown in this way that skepticism undercuts its own foundation, Augustine proceeds to identify at least three kinds of knowledge that escape all possible doubt. He does not join Zeno and other Stoics in the obviously futile and self-defeating attempt to find within sense perception itself a criterion of the truth of sense perceptions. Instead, he turns away from sense perception altogether, to find within thought itself knowledge that does not come into us from outside by way of the senses, and is therefore immune to the doubts that beset all sensation. The first and least significant such knowledge is that of one's own subjective states. Whether or not I am perceiving anything that exists independently of myself, and whether or not I am perceiving it as it is, the fact remains that I am having the perceptions that I am having. Do not assent to more than you are convinced that it appears thus to you, and there is no deception, says Augustine. Already here we have a movement inward, from the world to the self that experiences it, although such knowledge is the least interior, because what is known here is not thinking itself, but only its affections, and least significant, because it is not a knowledge of anything that transcends one's own individual subjectivity. A second, more significant kind of knowledge to which Augustine points is mathematics. This is knowledge of truths which, unlike subjective states, are universal, changeless, and absolute. He says, if there is one world and 6 worlds, there are 7 worlds, however I may be affected. And again, that 3 times 3 is 9, and is the square of intelligible numbers, is necessarily true, even if the human race is asleep. Augustine makes surprisingly little of mathematical knowledge in Against the Skeptics, but in On Order, written at about the same time, he argues that number is, quote, the index of universal truth, and describes numbers as divine and eternal. Later, in On Free Choice, he makes mathematical truth the center of his demonstration that God is, by showing that there is something which is eternal, unchangeable, and superior to the human mind. Having shown that the truth of number, for instance, 7 plus 3 equals 10, is identical for all minds, changeless, apprehended not by experience, but by the inner light that bodily sense does not know, he observes, when I consider the unchangeable truth of numbers within me, and its, as it were, inner sanctum or region, or whatever other appropriate name can be found by which we may name, as it were, the dwelling and seat of numbers, I am far removed from the body. The truth of number is superior to the human mind in that it is unchangeable, discovered rather than invented, and is the standard by which human minds are judged. Hence, numbers transcend even our minds and abide unchangeable in truth itself. Consequently, you will in no way deny that there is unchangeable truth, containing all these things which are unchangeably true. Unless it can be shown that mathematical truth is implied in any thought whatsoever, this is not an argument from performative contradiction. Nonetheless, it is worth dwelling on for the light it sheds on Augustine's worship of truth. His contention is not that the truth of numbers comes from God, or points to God, or depends on God. Rather, just in that it is universal, absolute, changeless, purely intelligible, transcending all things in space and time, satisfying the intellectual spirit's desire to know, the truth of numbers is God. Thus, Augustine triumphantly concludes his demonstration. I promised, if you remember, that I would show you that there is something higher than our mind and reason. There it is for you, truth itself. Embrace it if you can. Enjoy it. Delight in the Lord, and he will grant you the petitions of your heart. So too in the Confessions, having discovered changeless, intelligible truth in the depths of the self, he exclaims, O eternal truth and true love and beloved eternity, thou art my God, for thee I sigh day and night. Today's proponents of Platonism and mathematics prefer to call what we know in having such knowledge abstract objects, rather than intelligible numbers, divine and eternal, or simply God. But these abstract objects have all the characteristics of that which ancient Platonists call intelligible being, and which Augustine calls God. They are incorporeal, changeless, the same for all minds, outside of space and time, known by pure thought rather than perceived by the senses. Although modern abstract objects supposedly differ from Platonic intelligibles and Augustine's God in that they do not exercise causality, it is clear that the causality in question is only the crudest physical kind, which no ancient Platonist seriously attributed to intelligible reality. The Greek word aitia has a far broader range of meanings, signifying a responsible or explanatory factor of any kind, including logical priority. If 7 apples and 3 apples make 10 apples, and I know this prior to assembling and counting them, this is because the abstract objects or intelligible numbers, 7 itself and 3 itself, make 10 itself. It is in this logico-ontological sense, not as agents in the physical world, that these divine and eternal numbers, that is, intelligible realities, are causes. As long as we are willing to interpret divine causality in this sense, it offers no obstacle to identifying so-called abstract objects with Augustine's God. Today's anti-Platonists in mathematics will go to any length to avoid acknowledging that there are such realities and that mathematics is a knowledge of them, proposing instead theories such as fictionalism, psychologism, social constructionism, and so on. These are the people who refuse to believe in the multiplication table. Evidently, they are so terrified of divine transcendence that they would sooner deny that 3 times 3 is 9, or that 7 plus 3 is 10, than admit that there is absolute truth, transcending all space, time, and human or any other subjectivity. They argue that since humans exist entirely within space and time, whereas if there were abstract objects, they would not be in space and time, mathematics cannot be a knowledge of such objects. But as we know, one man's modus ponens is another's modus tollens. Ancient Platonists, such as Plato himself and Augustine, accept the inference but reverse the argument. For them, our capacity for mathematical knowledge shows that we are not wholly bound to space, time, and sense, but possess within ourselves eternal, intelligible, divine reality. Returning to Against the Skeptics, we find a third kind of indubitable knowledge, even deeper within and more fundamental than mathematics. This is dialectic or logic. For example, quote, this entire mass and frame of bodies in which we are, whether we are sleeping or mad or waking or sane, is either one or not one. And again, if there are 4 elements in the world, there are not 5. If there is one sun, there are not two. One soul cannot both die and be immortal. A man cannot be at once happy and miserable. It is not the case that both the sun shines here and it is night. We are now either awake or asleep. That which I seem to see is either a body or not a body. This amounts to an affirmation of the fundamental logical principles of non-contradiction and excluded middle. What are we knowing when we have such knowledge? Not anything in the world. Wittgenstein is certainly right to observe that when I know that it is raining or not raining, I am not knowing anything about the weather. But that is exactly Augustine's point. The knowledge of dialectic is the most interior of all. For in knowing such principles, I am knowing nothing in the world, but rather the necessary form of thought as such. Hence, this is implicitly a performative contradiction argument. To think at all is already to accept these principles, and so to be operating within the light of truth. It is precisely in this context that Aristotle argues that to say or think anything meaningful at all is already implicitly to affirm the principle of non-contradiction, while to refuse to do so is not to think anything, in effect to be a plant. Dialectic, Augustine says, is itself the science of truth. With the recognition of such principles, then, we arrive at truth itself as that which is always already presupposed in every act of thinking, prior to the affirmation of any particular truths about the world. In Augustine's soliloquies, the performative contradiction argument to the inescapability of truth becomes fully explicit. Reason argues, if this world will remain forever, it is true that the world will remain forever. What if it will not remain? Is it not then true that the world will not remain? What then when it has perished? If it is going to perish, will it not then be true that the world has perished? Therefore, there will be truth, even if the world should perish. What if truth itself should perish? Will it not then be true that truth has perished? But nothing can be true if there is no truth. In no way, therefore, can truth perish. Later in the soliloquies, Augustine repeats this argument more briefly. We concluded that truth cannot perish because if not only the whole world should perish, but even truth itself, it will be true that the world and truth have perished. But nothing is true without truth. Therefore, truth can in no way perish. What does this argument demonstrate? Many late medieval and modern logicians have taken it, and others like it, as an attempt to show that it's a proposition such as there is no truth entails it is true that there is no truth, and so contradicts itself. And some have tried to invalidate the argument by showing that the proposition need not lead to a self-contradiction. Such treatments, however, make the mistake of considering the proposition there is no truth in isolation from the act of thinking or asserting it. Thus, they treat the supposed contradiction as if it were an analytic rather than a performative contradiction. That is, a contradiction between two propositions or between two parts of one proposition, and then try to show that no such analytic contradiction is contained in or entailed by the proposition, there is no truth. But it is only when we consider the proposition performatively, not in isolation, but in the act of thinking or asserting it, that the contradiction emerges. As Vittorio Husserl notes, unlike an analytic contradiction, quote, a dialectical, that is performative contradiction, is a contradiction between what the proposition says and what the proposition is. Such contradictions cannot be disclosed through the formalization of propositional structures. If one formalizes, for example, the sentence, there is no truth with, there does not exist any X such that X is a truth, one cannot, much as one would like, catch sight of a contradiction. Such contradiction arises only if one reflects on the fact that the proposition itself necessarily claims to be a piece of true knowledge, if one explicates what it already presupposes, end quote. Augustine's argument thus exposes not an analytic but a performative contradiction involving claiming or thinking there is no truth, and therefore cannot be evaluated or invalidated on the basis of formal structures alone. Only when we consider the proposition there is no truth, not in isolation, but as the content of an act of thinking, does the contradiction in actu exercito reveal itself. What this argument demonstrates, therefore, is that truth is always already presupposed and implicit in any thought or judgment whatsoever, including the judgment truth has perished or there is no truth. In thinking anything at all, we are already in the presence of truth. So later in the soliloquies, reason says, truth cries out that it dwells within you. Thus, truth is altogether inescapable. If I try to escape from truth by denying that I am thinking, that denial is itself an act of thinking, and so remains bound to truth. To escape truth, not to think truth, is not to think at all. Here, even more explicitly than in Against the Skeptics, truth emerges as lux mentium, the light of minds, the indwelling condition in virtue of which it is possible for the mind to make any judgments at all. In Of True Religion, Augustine presents yet another version of the performative contradiction argument to truth. If you do not grasp the things I say and doubt whether they are true, grasp at least whether you do not doubt that you doubt about them. And if this is grasped, that you are doubting, ask whence this is grasped. Everyone who understands that he doubts understands something true and is certain about this thing that he understands. Therefore, he is certain about something true. Everyone, therefore, who doubts whether there is truth has in himself that true thing about which he does not doubt, and nothing can be true unless it is true by truth. He need not then doubt about truth, even if he can doubt from all sides. This argument is quite distinct from Augustine's well-known anticipation of the Cartesian cogito, si fallor sum. It aims to establish not that the self exists, but the truth exists. It runs not, I doubt, therefore I am, but rather, I doubt, therefore truth is. It is a performative contradiction argument because it reveals that the judgment I doubt necessarily involves taking that judgment itself as an undoubted truth. Once again, therefore, the argument leads to the discovery of truth as the inescapable presupposition of any thought or judgment whatsoever. So Augustine at once continues, where these things are seen, there is light without extension of places or times, and without any phantasm of such extensions. In Of True Religion, Augustine has already identified truth itself, the light within the mind that transcends all space, time, and sense, discovered by thought's self-reflexive recognition of the abiding condition for its own judgments, as God. Hence the argument in fact runs, I doubt, therefore God is. But truth, which is lux mentium, the light of minds, the condition of thinking, is also lux mundi, the light of the world, the principle of intelligibility, in virtue of which things in the world can be anything at all. To be something, and so to be, is to have some whatness, some intelligibility, and in that sense, some truth. Regarding a tree, for example, reason says in the soliloquies, you will not deny that it is a true tree if it is a tree. For if it is a false tree, it is not a tree. But if it is a tree, it is necessarily a true one. Hence, the ideas in our minds, in terms of which we make judgments as to what things are, must be the very forms that constitute the whatness, the intelligibility, the being of all things. Otherwise, our judgments, such as this is a tree, could not be true of the things themselves, and things themselves would have no truth, would not be anything at all. So in Of True Religion, again arguing to God as truth itself, Augustine says, truth is the form of true things. True things are true insofar as they are. Without such truth of things, all intelligibility, hence all reality, would be imposed or constructed by us, exactly as today's anti-Platonic truth deniers would have it. But if we cannot take our thoughts to be true of things, we fall once more into performative contradiction. In this way, again, all thinking necessarily presupposes truth itself, the identity of thinking and being, which Augustine identifies as God within the soul. In arguing to God as truth, at once letting things be anything and letting our judgments be true, Augustine is thus taking up Plato's response to the truth of Protagoras, man is the measure of all things, of which the modern equivalent is Nietzsche's there are no facts, only interpretations, to which we must always reply, is that a fact? Perhaps the only true thing Richard Rorty ever said is that in the debate between Plato and Protagoras, he sides with the latter. The truth of Protagoras is that there is no truth. Hence, in the Theaetetus, Plato uses the performative contradiction argument to show that Protagoras' dictum undermines itself. Plato says, he admits that the opinion of those who judge the opposite about his own opinion, namely those who judge that it is false, is true. Therefore, he would grant that his own opinion is false, if he admits that the opinion of those who judge that it is false is true. So in the Phaedo, after mentioning forms such as the just, the beautiful, and the good, as well as the more mundane examples, largeness, health, and strength, Socrates refers to them as the reality, ousia, of all other things, what each is, and what is most true of them. Forms are Plato's answer to Protagoras, because without such intelligible whatnesses, it would not be true of anything that it is large or strong or healthy or anything else, and therefore nothing would be anything, and there would be no truth. Plato frequently uses the hendiadys, truth and being, to refer to forms as the intelligibility in virtue of which things are what they are, and so are at all. In that forms themselves by themselves are purely intelligible, timeless, changeless, transcending all the variability, subjectivity, and relativity of human opinion, Plato regularly describes them as divine. Thus, in the Laws, he lays down his ultimate response to Protagoras. God is for us above all the measure of all things, far more indeed than, as they say, any man. While in Plato's language, the word God does not name a unique divine person, but refers to anyone or anything that is divine, for Augustine, the measure of all things, truth and being, the intelligibility in virtue of which judgments can be true and things can be anything, is indeed God himself. Plato argues that the soul discovers the forms, the divine intelligibility, the truth and being of things within itself, as that to which it refers the things that it perceives through the senses in making judgments as to what they are. So too Plotinus, arguing that the rational soul finds divine intelligible reality or intellect within itself, observes, since then there is soul that reasons about just and beautiful things, and reasoning that inquires whether this is just or that is beautiful, there must also be some fixed justice from which there comes to be reasoning at the level of soul. Or how else could it reason? There must be in us intellect, which does not reason discursively, but always possesses justice. End quote. Here, justice and beauty serve simply as stock Platonic examples of forms. The same could be said of reasoning that inquires whether this is large or that is healthy, whether this is strong or that is a tree. Plato's truth and being, Plotinus' divine intellect that eternally possesses or is one with all forms, discovered within the rational soul as the condition for its discursive judgments, is Augustine's God. Thus, Augustine adopts from the books of the Platonists the argument that this divine measure or standard must be present within the soul as the condition for our making any true judgments of things. So in the Confessions, he says, asking whence I might approve the beauty of bodies, and what might be present to me when I rightly judge and say, this ought to be so and that not so. Asking therefore this, whence I judge when I so judge, I discover the unchangeable and true eternity of truth above my changeable mind. Since for Augustine as for Plotinus, the beauty of anything is its intelligibility or being, this standard of judgment embraces within itself all the intelligibility, all the form, all the being of all things. Likewise, in Of True Religion, he argues that since the standard by which we make such judgment is changeless, quote, it is sufficiently clear that the rule that is called truth is above our mind, and at once continues, nor then is it to be doubted that the unchangeable nature which is above the rational soul is God. In his later works, Augustine claims that his doctrine of God as the inner light is different from Plato's account of pre-existence and recollection. But this is merely because, like so many people up to the present day, he takes Plato to be affirming a literal pre-existence of the soul. If we attend to Plato's numerous indications that the story of pre-existence, fall, and recollection is not a theory or a doctrine, but a myth, not to be taken literally, the seeming difference disappears. The meaning of Plato's myth of recollection is that, as he says in the Meno, the truth of beings is always in the soul, or as he puts it in the Phaedo, intelligible reality is ours. We can metaphorically be said to have forgotten and to recollect it, in that it is latent, that is present but neglected within us, to be discovered through a self-reflexive inward turn, whereby the soul reflects on the condition for its own judgments. Plato's prior knowledge and Augustine's divine light are simply two metaphorical expressions of this condition. Thus, we return to Augustine's understanding of God as truth itself, neglected but discoverable within the soul, at once the light of minds and the light of the world, the intelligibility which is the condition for thought to be true, and for things in the world to be what they are, and so to be at all. In our own time, Augustine's performative contradiction to God as truth has been revived by two thinkers, both of whom I've already had occasion to cite. The first is the Belgian Jesuit Gaston Isay, who presents the thought of his teacher, Father Pierre Scheuer, as an interior and rigorous metaphysic, beginning with the inescapability of truth as revealed by the performative contradiction argument, to which Ise gives the name retortion. He points out that, quote, in every judgment, I affirm the objectivity of my thought. In other words, in every judgment, I implicitly claim to be right in making this judgment. And all concrete judgments carry the same imprint, the affirmation of objectivity. This first abstract principle of the objectivity of thought expresses precisely that there is an identity between being and the affirmable. If we call intellect the faculty which affirms, there is clearly an identity between being and being as intelligible, end quote. But this necessary identity, first expressly articulated by Parmenides, leads directly to God. Quote, the essence of thought absolutely demands the identity between thought and being. God alone realizes it. Hence, by reasoning, we explicate the nature of thought, and in this way, we prove that God is the ever-present affirmation. In actu exercito, implicitly, the affirmation of the existence of God is, in me, the prime mover of my first affirmation, whether this affirmation concerns the white, the red, or the hot, end quote. To think, to affirm anything, this is white, that is hot, is already to affirm God as truth, the fundamental identity of thinking and being. As in Augustine, whom Ise mentions but does not sufficiently credit with having made exactly the same argument, this is an interior metaphysic because it arrives at God not by inference from the world to a first cause, but by thought's self-reflexive discovery of the always present condition implicit in its own activity of affirmation. Augustine's argument has been reprised with even greater exactitude and even less acknowledgement by the German-American philosopher Vittorio Husserl, who makes it the foundation of what he somewhat misleadingly terms objective idealism. He begins, quote, the fundamental statement of objective idealism, which is to be proved, reads, there is non-hypothetical, i.e. presuppositionless, synthetic a priori knowledge, and the laws of this a priori knowledge are at the same time the laws of reality, end quote. His proof consists of an exceptionally thorough, precise, and rigorous demonstration that the negation of this statement is a performative contradiction, or as Husserl calls it, a dialectical or pragmatic contradiction. He summarizes, quote, a proposition can count as non-hypothetical a priori knowledge precisely if its negation is dialectically contradictory. Therefore, if it cannot be disputed without giving rise to a pragmatic contradiction. The ultimately founded propositions are propositions which are presupposed by the every act of cognition, just because they explicate only what is already implicit in the form of a proposition qua proposition, of a cognition qua cognition, end quote. Husserl offers as an example the proposition, there is truth, and adds, concerning the validity of the principle of non-contradiction, it is evident that this principle is the condition for the possibility of all knowledge and truth. For if a theory that contradicts itself can be true, the true proposition could at the same time be false. But then every difference of truth value and the sense of every discussion would be lost, end quote. Here we return to Augustine's treatment of non-contradiction as the very form of thought itself, of dialectic as the science of truth. Arguing that the ultimately founded propositions have their place in an absolute reason, Husserl continues, and here I apologize for reading such a long quotation, but I want to highlight the uncanny extent to which Husserl, it seems unwittingly, is channeling Augustine. To accept non-hypothetical a priori knowledge with an ontological valence means to accept such an absolute reason. One might speak of a proof of God by the logic of truth, just like Augustine. It is clear, indeed, that this absolute reason may be neither reified nor objectified, that the concept of God obtained by objective idealism cannot be set off sharply enough from most of the traditional concepts of God, not Augustine's. For these usually understand God in an objectivist realist fashion as an object, not Augustine. By contrast, according to what we have said, God, the absolute, is nothing other than the totality of a priori truths, i.e. of the autonomy of reason, which, to be sure, are not anything merely subjective or intersubjective, but constitute the essence of reality. God is here not a beyond, but rather the innermost, the center of thinking, which underlies every being and is presupposed in every act of thinking. Theonomy and autonomy coincide. Then he continues. The traditional predicates of God receive a new sense, new, from this rational reconstruction of the concept of the absolute mediated by transcendental philosophy. As the totality of all a priori truths, the absolute is that which one cannot negate without at the same time presupposing it, that which one cannot escape without being caught up in it, indeed having always already been caught up in it. One cannot step outside of the absolute, the ontologically grasped reason. It is omnipresent, eternal. There is nothing in space and time that does not participate in its structure. It is the principle of all knowledge, the intelligible light that first makes knowledge possible. It is that which founds intersubjectivity. And it is, so to speak, the most hidden, just insofar as it is so near that one can by no means know it in intentione recta. Only if one first looks back, reflects, speculates on one's own thinking, will one become aware of it. Does Husserl realize that every word of this, far from being anything new, is exactly what we find in Augustine? If so, he should say so. If not, this is a major blind spot in his reading of the history of philosophy. What Husserl presumably means by the traditional concepts of God, which usually understand God as an object, and in relation to which any of this is new, are in fact nothing traditional at all, but rather those of modern theism. But really, who is more traditional, at least in Western Christian thought, than Augustine? And the first and last lesson to be learned from Augustine can be summed up in a single great commandment. Thou shalt not objectify the Lord thy God. For Augustine, the externalization of God as an object outside the self is the fundamental source of all error, religious, ethical, epistemological, and metaphysical. It is the source of all religious error, because it means worshiping as God anything in the world, any true thing, rather than truth itself within the mind, and so constitutes idolatry. It is the source of all ethical error, for it means placing our happiness in anything in the world, and so falling into the three great vices of lust, pride, and curiosity, all of which consist in exteriority, orienting our attention and desire outward to things in the world, rather than inward to truth itself, the satisfaction of the intellectual appetite. It is the source of all epistemological error, for it means seeking knowledge through sense perception, whereby things enter into our awareness from outside, rather than turning inward to become aware of truth itself as, in Husserl's words, the principle of all knowledge, the intelligible light that first makes knowledge possible. And it is the source of all metaphysical error, for it means taking the world or anything in it as ultimate reality, rather than truth itself. As Husserl puts it, the essence of reality, the innermost, the center of thinking, which underlies every being. Augustine's light of minds and light of the world, giving me to think and all things to be. Augustine's famous cry, "Late have I loved thee, beauty so ancient and so new, late have I loved thee, and behold, thou wert within and I outside. Thou wert with me and I was not with thee," is no mere devotional outburst, but a precise philosophical statement. God is to be found not by looking to any object, in intentione recta, but only by turning inward to attend to truth, the intelligible light that suffuses the mind, that goes unnoticed precisely because it is too near, or rather wholly present, revealed by performative contradiction to be always already presupposed in every act of thinking, while our thoughts are turned outward to objects rather than inward to their own inescapable condition. Thou wert with me, I was not with thee. Much of the Confessions is the story of how Augustine learned through the books of the Platonists to understand God as not any object, but truth itself, not absent or elsewhere, but implicit in my every thought, inner than my inmost and higher than my highmost, the light of minds that enables all thinking as corporeal light enables all seeing. I think, therefore God is. O eternal truth and true love and beloved eternity, thou art my God. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very riveting and stimulating and passionate, if not also precise, paper.
I hope to be both.
Good. Yes, and I appreciate the passion that you bring to this, even if we don't all agree. So we have time for this discussion about actually more than 15 minutes. So floor is open for any questions. Let me check out YouTube really briefly as well, just to see.
It's very late for most people.
Yes, yes. And in Hong Kong, we like to get up early and stay up late. It's too hot to be up too early. But okay. Any questions here? I will happily ask the first question.
I have a question. Also, Eric, could you stop sharing your screen so I can see more people?
Let me, how do I take that down? There it is.
That was not my question, but do you want to go first, Greg, or do you want me to?
No, Ian, please. Floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Eric. I guess my question has two parts. And the first part, I think, is just clarification. And that is, I'd like you to explain a bit more how we move from truth as pertaining to propositions to truth as the condition for making true judgments, and what the nature of that truth is, how they differ from one another. And then the second step would be, I know your work on Neo-Platonism. What's the status of the one or the good that's the source of knowledge and truth? I guess I'm asking you to talk about three layers, maybe the one or the good beyond being, the second layer being the relationship between the identity between thinking and being, and then true judgments. Could you sort those out?
Yeah, let me take them in the reverse order though, because I think the second question about the one or good is easier to answer. And as far as that goes, it just seems to me that Augustine simply doesn't pick that up. For him, God, the supreme, the absolute, is Plotinus intellect, which is one with intelligible being. It is Plato's forms taken all together as one. He just doesn't seem to follow Plotinus in the notion that you have to go higher. There's partly, I think, a Trinitarian move there, that in Plotinus, intellect is the logos of the one. And for Plotinus, that involves saying that intellect is lesser than, subordinate to the one. Whereas for, Augustine picks up that relationship, so that for him, intellect, which corresponds to the Son, the Word, the Logos, is the Logos of the Father, who in that sense corresponds to the Neoplatonic one. But because for, post-Nicene theology, they have to be equal, the Son cannot be lesser than the Father. The effect of that for Augustine is to bring God, all three persons, so to speak, down to the level of Plotinus intellect. So I just don't see in Augustine, at least, here and there you find these, he'll say things like God is incomprehensible and things like that, but systematically speaking, for him, intelligible reality, intelligible being is God, is what God is. And he just never picks up that Neoplatonic idea that you have to go higher. So I just don't think that's there in Augustine's thought. As for the first question about going from the truth of propositions to truth as the condition for true judgments, the point is, as far as I can see it, is that a judgment, in making a judgment, we are affirming the truth of that judgment. Therefore, truth itself is the condition for true judgments, right? There couldn't, in other words, in making any judgment, we are already, as a couple of the people I quoted put it, saying we're claiming to be right in making that judgment. Otherwise, you're not making that judgment. And that is to say that the truth of the judgments that you are making is involved, is implicit in the very act of making those judgments. So that's the sense in which truth is the condition for the possibility of judgments.
Yeah, if I could, sorry, are you done? Could I follow up a little bit on that? Well, I guess what I'm wondering about is, do we want to then say of that truth that it is true? And so then we sort of get into a kind of regress here. And so I guess I'm wondering about, so if we say of the truth, that's the condition for true judgments, that it is true, then there's a worry that we'll be stepping back and needing to ask, well, is that true? Is that pointing us to some deeper truth? So I guess I was just wondering, like, the performative contradiction issue does point toward truth, truth itself, as you're saying. I guess I'm wondering about our ability to talk about that, or the nature of the proposition at the level of truth itself.
I'm not sure what you mean by our ability to talk about it. The point is that I suppose we could put it this way: we always are talking about it, because in saying anything, it's like we're working with, so to speak, truth. To use the analogy, and of course this is exactly where Augustine is going, where I got the taking the title of this paper from. It's the difference between attending to things we can see, and in the act of seeing, we're not attending to light, just the things that are illuminated. But then we can realize that we can ask ourselves, how is it possible that I can see things? Oh, there's light. We can't see the light directly. We can become aware of it as the condition for seeing. So I think that's a very good analogy, that we can't, to put it in the terms you just asked about, we can't speak of truth itself directly. We can become aware of it as the condition for any speaking, any thinking, any affirmation.
That helped me a little bit. Thanks for the question. Very interesting. Any further questions, follow-up questions, or? Maybe I'll take the opportunity then to ask a question. Ian asked a lot of questions that I had as well, so I feel like some of those have been answered, especially about the good beyond being. That was very helpful, and Augustine's identification of God and intellect was very helpful.
Let me just, could I just say another word about that?
Please, please.
In that respect, it seems to me that Augustine is, one way of putting it would be to say he's more like a Middle Platonist than like a Neo-Platonist. And another way of saying the same thing would be to say, in some respects, he's more actually, even though he himself doesn't realize this, he's more Aristotelian than Platonic.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to follow up on as well. Yes. So let me follow up on this Aristotelian side. And perhaps this is actually something also that is shared with Plato in some respect. But I want to follow up about this, the question about what truth is. And I think it's right that we think of truth not simply as a property of a proposition or a property of a belief, however else we want to subjectivize it. But the Greeks had a higher understanding of truth as a way of saying being, and this, of course, is Aristotle's metaphysics. If you look in Book Delta, and you see all the ways of saying being, you have the categories, thinghood, you have all this potent, okay, being at work, whatever. But then you have truth, and then of course truth is said in many ways too. There's the truth of combination, of proposition, and then there's the truth that comes via nous. There's nous, and
which is identity,
exactly,
of thinking and being.
Yeah. And so this is exactly what I wanted to follow on. And so it's interesting to see how not only can you, I think very interestingly, use this to critique relativists, but also those who would make truth into something, they would want to hold on to it, but they want to make it somehow a property of a proposition or something. So you have these steps towards, one could say, the elimination of truth itself, that maybe proceeds through forms of subjectivization that reach their culmination in something like more contemporary forms of relativism.
Yeah, I would put it something like this, that we can have, in a carefully nuanced way, a correspondence theory of truth, that is, of the truth of propositions. But that depends on, that can't be allowed to stand by itself. It doesn't work.
Exactly.
That kind of truth depends on a prior truth, which is the identity, truth not as correspondence, but as identity of thought and being.
Yeah.
Here's a way I like to think about it, that the classic argument against correspondence theories of truth is, how can we know whether our thoughts correspond? If we've got our thoughts, how can we know whether they correspond to something else? And that's Hume, but it becomes this classic view that in order to know whether or not a proposition corresponds to what is, we would have to be able to adopt a stance, well, the God's eye view, right, above both, right, above the subject and the object, to see whether they correspond to each other, right? And from there, I see only two ways to go. One is the usual way nowadays to say, well, since obviously we don't have access to that God's eye view, we have to abandon correspondence theory of truth. Or say, yeah, it follows that we do have access to the God's eye view, which is exactly where Augustine goes. He's insisting God is within us, otherwise we could not be thinking. We discursively, humanly, could not be thinking unless that identity, which is truth itself, is active, illumining us, right? That's the metaphor. So I don't go with the people like Putnam, Appel, and this isn't my area at all, this contemporary stuff, but I've poked around it in looking into this issue of truth. And it's very common. They just take it for granted that we don't have the God's eye view. And then the whole thing collapses. Then you can't have truth at all. Right? And the alternative is the Platonic one. And I would argue you can find it in ways in Plato and Aristotle. I would say this is what's going on with Aristotle's theory of the productive intellect. In Plotinus, we find intellect itself within us, right? And in Augustine, in order to avoid collapsing into this, complete, Protagoras, Cratylus, there is no truth thing. We have to say, we find the God's eye view, that is to say, God, within ourselves. Yeah, the only alternative is this total collapse into nihilism.
Yeah, I totally with you that the God's eye view is the way to go, and it's the only way that can be gone, or something like that. But I'll move it over to the other people. Sean first, and then Elizabeth, and then I think we should stop after that. We have a 2-hour break, so I think it's okay if we go over a few minutes. So as long as Eric doesn't mind staying a few extra minutes to answer the question.
No, fine, that's fine.
Okay, good. All right, Sean, please.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So first of all, I think this idea that we can productively distinguish what Augustine is saying from Plotinus and Porphyry is really generative. It's something I've thought a lot about as well. And so I was glad to hear you say that maybe we need to appreciate how Augustine differs from some of those thinkers that we traditionally think of as laying the groundwork for him. But my question relates to that, and also maybe a way that we can relate Dr. Moran's paper to Dr. Pearl's. And that has to do with Marius Victorinus, right, as sort of the connective tissue between Plotinus and Porphyry and Augustine. Dr. Moran's paper cited Marius Victorinus multiple times and sort of pointed to the fairly early examples of something like apophaticism, of fairly strong apophaticism, I thought, in the 4th century, especially for a Latin Christian author. It's not a big surprise, I suppose, given that Victorinus was such a good reader of Greek and translator of Greek. But I was trying to formulate this question earlier and I couldn't quite find the right terms. But what I was curious about is, if Victorinus is being so epiphatic in the 4th century, kind of like Gregory of Nyssa in the Greek tradition on the Cappadocian side, and then Augustine kind of isn't, right? I mean, as Dr. Pearl mentioned, there's a few passages you can kind of push in that direction, but largely Augustine is not following that path. What do we do with that information? Do we say that Augustine sort of lacked, I think, what was called earlier the Greek subtlety of some of the other fathers, or some of the other fathers and the non-Christian Greek Neoplatonists as well? Or do we interpret that as a more active rejection of the apophatic path and an embrace of maybe something closer to what Dr. Pearl's been describing here? So to just simplify that question a little bit, Dr. Pearl, do you think that Augustine is sort of just lacking almost the wherewithal to go down that path of someone like Marius Victorinus or Gregory of Nyssa? Or do you think he's actively rejecting that and following a different path that has more to do with kind of a more direct link between, I don't know, timeless mathematical truth and the truth that is God?
I would really, this fits with the theme of the conference, doesn't it? I really want to answer both to that question. I am inclined to think, and this is partly why, I'm returning after many, many years to work with Augustine now, after not working with him for a long, long time and working with the Greek Neoplatonism, in part because I really think he doesn't have that level of, whether you want to call it subtlety or philosophical sophistication or whatever. My impression is that he didn't get what Plotinus was doing in that particular respect. So I might say, yeah, all right, lacking something, but at the same time, there's something strongly positive there, that there is this very strong affirmation of intelligibility. And at this point, there's an element of sort of speculative psychobiography going on here. What was going on in Augustine's mind? But my impression is that it's something along these lines. Augustine, in the Confessions, makes a big deal about how, until he read the books of the Platonists, which means primarily Plotinus, that's clear enough, until he read that, he could not get the notion of intelligible being. He couldn't imagine anything that is not a body. And so as soon as he arrives, it's just like this blinding, dazzling moment for him when he arrives. Intelligible being, form, that's it, that's what I needed. And so he says, that's God. And so he doesn't look any further, you might say, because he's so astounded, he's struck by that Platonic notion. Form, intelligible being, truth, and what goes with that in some ways might be even deeper in Augustine is his adoration of eternity. Again and again and again in his works, as soon as he arrives at something that is eternal, boom, that's God. And so he doesn't look further. So since Plato's forms, Plotinus' intellect, which is the forms, being, truth, the truth of mathematics, because it is eternal, he just instantly makes the move to say, that's God. And so again, he just doesn't see a need to move any further because he's just so intellectually overwhelmed by the very notion of incorporeal, supersensible, transcendent in the relative sense, right? It's not absolutely transcendent like the one in Plotinus, but transcendent relative to the realm of space and time in that sense, transcendent, intelligible, timeless, incorporeal, supersensible being, that's what he calls God. And therefore the difference between intellect or being and the one or good just doesn't seem to be of any great interest to him.
Okay. Thanks a lot. And Elizabeth?
Yeah, so just very quickly, I was thinking if maybe, so I was thinking about the on free will, where Augustine is giving his proof for the existence of God, and he demonstrates the existence of these mathematical truths. 7 plus 3 is 10. And then the truth and order of numbers. And then he goes on to a discussion of the truth of the virtues, right? And he does something then before he says, so he's got these, eternal unchanging truths, mathematical truths, moral truths, truths having to do with the virtues. So he's got like this plurality of truths, and they're all timeless and they're all eternal and they're all things you can discover, and it's, this, so you described that, I thought, very well. But there is a moment where he says, and these truths are all contained in truth itself. So I'm wondering if there's not sort of a truth of truths, that God is a truth of truths and not to be immediately identified with the mathematical truths or the intelligibles, the forms, that there is some, I'm not saying it goes back to the one, but that there is another move, at least in that text, where he doesn't explain in that text what he means. It's like a very quick thing, and it's not clear it's the source of the truths, but it doesn't have the feeling, to me anyway, that we're just talking about the sum of truths or just some collection of truths and that's God, but that these truths are somehow contained in God. And so I wondered if you had anything to say about that moment.
Well, as you say, he doesn't explain what that means, but I read it rather differently from you. I read it as saying that that God truth is maybe the sum or the collection is a little too weak, but the totality, the all-in-one of all such truths, but not the source of them, not superior to them, but just the word that rather inadequately I translated as totality in that quotation from Husserl. The German word I think is better, Inbegriff, the ingathering, the ingrasping together, right, of all a priori truths. And I think that it's something along those lines is what Augustine means, but I don't think it's something that is higher than those truths. It's all of them together. It's also striking. A long time ago, Norris Clark made this point, that Augustine just doesn't seem to be worried, so to speak, about divine simplicity, that this attribution of some kind of multiplicity to God. It just doesn't trouble him, right? And I would elaborate on that a bit by saying that, unlike both Plotinus in his way and Thomas Aquinas in a slightly different way, both of whom you could almost say obsessed with the simplicity of the first principle, so that whatever involves any sort of trace of multiplicity or distinction whatsoever can't be the first. You don't find that in Augustine. He just doesn't worry about the multiplicity of divine ideas, and he doesn't seem to think he has to develop a theory that's going to explain how there can be multiple ideas in God without violating the divine simplicity and so on. He just isn't bothered by it. And again, my explanation for that, as far as it goes, is that instead, Augustine is, so to speak, obsessed with eternity rather than simplicity as the so to speak, defining character that identifies something as God. So as soon as he arrives at something eternal, he says that's God, and he just isn't bothered by that there are many truths which are all contained within truth. But what he does say in the passage you're referring to, which I quoted, in fact, is something, I don't remember the Latin word, that contains or comprehends, rather than is the source of, or something.
Yeah,
like that.
I didn't mean to. He definitely doesn't say source of,
Yeah.
but I wasn't thinking how do we want to think about how it contains.
I think it's the way Plotinus intellect contains all forms.
Yeah.
Okay, there is a question from YouTube. I know we've gone over, but maybe we could briefly address it because it is nice to include people who are watching and are not with us on Zoom. So the question is in the chat, but I'll just read it out also for anyone watching. Is truth not true insofar as it is thought to be the absolute, as a self-complete totality of thinking and being without prior cause? How can we know the truth that the truth is not by itself true? In other words, the truth needs the one to be true.
I have a couple of things I want to say about that. The first one is that the expression, the absolute as a self-complete totality of thinking and being without prior cause, that I think that's a very apt and solid description of exactly what God, that is truth, is for Augustine. And the other part of it, well, that reopens the question. If I'm right, that Augustine is different from Plotinus, for example, in the way I'm describing, then that opens the further question, which of them has got it right? I would say, I'll come out, I'm a Platinian, not an Augustinian on that, a Greek Neo-Platonist, if you like. And I would say that truth, precisely as we'll put it this way, Hegel, again, I think is helpful here. The identity of thinking and being, fine. But as Hegel points out, an identity statement like that, unless there is also a difference between them, it's just a tautology. It doesn't say anything. So, and that's what you have in Plotinus, right? That intellect and being are one, but that one is two because it's intellect and being. It's not a denial of some kind of their identity, but it's an identity of two things which are one. Right? And therefore we have to go higher. We have to go beyond. And again, notice that connects back to the issue of divine simplicity that I was just mentioning, that Augustine doesn't think or doesn't see that that's the case, or isn't troubled by any distinction between thinking and being, like Aristotle, who sees that as perfectly simple. So, if this is intended as an objection to Augustine in favor of Plotinus, I would simply concur. Yes, I think it isn't an objection, but we should see what Augustine himself is doing, which in this respect, and again, Augustine knows very little Aristotle, it seems. In some ways, it's all the more striking how close he comes. That Aristotle's first mover is thinking, which is being, which is thinking, which is being, thought thinking itself. But what is itself? The intelligible that is being, is what Aristotle says. And Aristotle sees no duality there whatsoever. And likewise, Augustine, I think, sees no duality, at least not of the kind that would compel a move to some kind of transcendence, beyond that. What Augustine sees is, of course, not duality, but triplicity, because it's a Trinitarian. And part of what he's doing is picking up a passage in Plotinus where Plotinus says it's not just intellect and the intelligible are one, but he says intellect, intellection, intelligible, and these are one. It's got nous, noesis, noiton, and these are one. And I think Augustine is working with that and using that idea to make sense of the Trinity, where will, the Holy or love, the Holy Spirit, takes the place of the noesis, the intellection. So for Augustine, noeton, the intelligible, is just what God is, would be the Father. Intellect, knowing that same content, therefore the same as it, is the Son. And noesis, the act whereby intellect is one, the Son is one with intelligible, the Father, is the Holy Spirit. But unlike Plotinus, Augustine then, of course, doesn't say, well, since they are three, we have to look to a higher principle to you know, that transcends them, because there's a plurality there. He just says, and he just picks up what Plotinus says, and these are one. Intellect has as its content the intelligible, and intellection just is the possessing of that content. They're all the same, and therefore doesn't see any need to look any higher.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation, and I'm glad we were able to go a little longer with questions and answers and discussions. I learned a lot from the session. So thank you again, Eric Pearl, for your presentation, and thanks everybody for your questions and discussion. So hopefully I'll see some of you at 1 o'clock. For others of you, I know that will be too late, but if I don't see you in 2 hours, I'll see you hopefully tomorrow or the day after. Okay, so we'll come back together at about 1 o'clock Hong Kong time. All right, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, thank you.